There we go. Alright, we're good. So I want to apologize for not finishing this story during the month of October. I got distracted by too many things. So I want to make up to it. I thought I'd ask if you wanted me to finish the story despite the fact that October's over, and most of you said yes, so we're gonna do it. Oh, hi, Smile. How you doing? Alright, let's... Nice to see you, too. Alright, let's start the music. Press play. Alright. Let's see. Chapter 7. Oh, passed it. There we are. As you can see, we're halfway done with the book. Yeah, I'm doing great. Alright then. Chapter 7. They made their way back through the corridors of the abandoned mall, not bothering to be cautious with their footsteps or the beams of their lights. So much for being sneaky, Charlie said, darkly, but no one responded. By silent consensus, their pace quickened steadily. By the time they reached the parking lot, they were almost running. Spotting her car as they came out the front door, Charlie felt an almost physical relief to see it, like it was an old friend. Someone should stay here, she said, pausing with her hand on the door handle. We can't leave Carlton. No, Marla said firmly. We're leaving now. They looked at her in surprise for a moment. Suddenly she was talking to them all the way she talked to Jason. Sister knows best. Lamar and Jason exchanged glances, but no one said anything. We're going into town, all of us, she added, giving Charlie a warning look, and we're finding help. They hurried into their cars as Charlie took the wheel. John got into the passenger seat, and she smiled tightly at him. Jessica climbed into the back a moment later, and Charlie felt a minor disappointment. She had wanted to talk to him alone. We're running for help. It's not a date, she scolded at herself, but that hadn't really been the point. He felt safe, a touchstone amid the strange things that were happening all around them. She looked over at him, but he was staring out the window. They pulled out of the lot, following Marla's car as she sped into the darkness. When they reached the town, Marla yanked her car to the side of the main street and stopped, and Charlie followed suit. Before the car had fully come to a halt, Jessica leaped out of the backseat and started running. Marla followed a step behind. They stopped in front of the movie theater, and only then did Charlie see that there was a cop in uniform beneath the marquee. Leaning back against his black and white car, his eyes widened at the sight of the young women barreling towards him, and he took an involuntary step back as Marla started talking without pausing for a breath. Please, you've got to come, Marla was finishing as the others caught up. The cop looked a little bewildered. He had a shiny pink face, and his hair was so short it was entirely covered by his hat. He was young, maybe mid-20s, Charlie realized, and he was looking at them skeptically. Is this an actual emergency, he said. You may not realize it, but pranks can get you into real trouble. Jessica rolled her eyes and stepped forward, closing the distance between them. We're not playing a prank, she said crisply, and Charlie suddenly remembered how tall she was. Our friend is trapped in that abandoned shopping mall, and it's your job to help us. The shopping mall? He seemed confused, then looked in the direction they came from. That shopping mall? Okay. See you later, Smile. His eyes widened, and then he frowned at them reproachfully, looking remarkably like a disappointed parent despite his youth. What were you doing up there in the first place? Charlie and Marla exchanged glances, but Jessica didn't blink. Deal with us later. He's in danger, and you have to help us, officer. She leaned in and peered at his name tag. Officer Dunn. Do you want me to go to the fire department? Despite her fear, Charlie almost laughed. Jessica said it was as if she were a store, threatening to take her business elsewhere. It was so absurd it should have gotten her no more than a puzzled glance, but Dunn reached for his radio hastily. "No," he said. "Hang on." He pressed a button, and the radio emitted a short burst of static. Charlie felt a brief chill at the sound, as she looked around, she saw John, Stephen, and Jason take a tiny step closer to Marla, not seeming to notice their reactions. Dunn barked incomprehensible sounds into his radio, talking in cop code, and Charlie suddenly had a flash of memory and running around the yard, whispering into walkie-talkies with Marla. They could never understand each other on the cheap toys her father had found in the drugstore bargains bin. But they didn't mind. Actual communication was never the point. "Charlie, come on," Jessica shouted at her, and Charlie came back to herself. Everyone was heading toward the cars and piling back in. Marla pulled out in front, and the cop followed her, with Charlie bringing up the rear. "Why doesn't he have the siren on?" Jessica said. Her voice was thin and brittle, as if her only choices were a sharp tongue or tears. "He doesn't believe us," John said softly. She should have the siren on," Jessica said, and this time it was almost a whisper. Charlie's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as she stared straight ahead at the cop's red taillights. When they got back to the mall, Jessica dashed ahead, forcing the rest of them to run behind her. Charlie didn't mind. It felt good to run purposeful. Lamar was talking to the cop as they ran, shouting over the noise of their thudding feet. "The restaurant is all boarded up, but there's a door left open," he said, the words broken by his uneven breathing. "Behind the plastic, you move it, dark alley, Carlton smells like feet." Officer Dunn stuttered briefly, but he regained his stride. When they reached the alley, they slowed their pace, moving more cautiously down the narrow hall until they came to the door. "Right here," John said, and Dunn moved forward to help with the shelf. They drew it back too fast, the contents rattling and wobbling. The shelf pitched backward, and tools and cables and paint cans full of nails crashed to the floor. "Ow!" John yelled as the hammer bounced off his foot. They all watched as the thing scattered, rolling away and vanishing down the dark corridor. "What?" Jason wailed. As they all looked up from the spill, he was pointing at the door. "What? What is this?" Marla gasped. The door had chains strung across it from top to bottom, 3 enormous padlocks holding them all together. The links were bolted into the metal frame of the door, and they were heavy too, heavy to cut without special tools. It was all rusty. The whole thing looked as though it had been there for years. Charlie walked up to the door and touched the chain as if to be sure it was real. "This wasn't here," she said, the words sounding insane as she spoke. "We have to get him out," Jason cried haltingly, his hands covering his eyes. "Bonnie is going to kill him, and it's my fault." "What's he talking about?" the police officer said, looking at them with renewed suspicion. "Who is Bonnie, and why is she going to hurt your friend?" It's a robot," Charlie said quickly. "The robots from Freddy Fazbear's are still there, and they still work." "Freddy Fazbear's," Dunn's face flushed, and he looked at the door again. "I used to go there as a kid," he said softly, his tone caught between nostalgia and fear. He caught himself quickly and cleared his throat. "He came to life," Jason insisted, no longer making the effort to hide his tears. Dunn bent down to his height and his tone softening. "What's your name?" he said. "We have to get him out," Jason repeated. "His name is Jason," Marla said, and Jason glared at her. "Jason," Dunn said. He put a hand on Jason's shoulder, glancing at the others with an obvious suspicion. "He thinks we made him say that." Charlie realized. Jason wriggled in Dunn's grasp, but the officer did not let go, looking in the eye and asked the question. "Jason, did they tell you to say this? What's going on here?" Irritated, Jason pulled free and took a large step back. "That's what really happened," he said firmly. Officer Dunn exhaled a long, slow vent of frustration, then got to his feet, shedding his kid-friendly act. "So the robots took your friend," he said. I know what you're trying to pull, said his tone. We were in there, Charlie stated flatly, keeping her voice level, as if saying it calmly and plainly enough might convince him that they were not telling lies. Our friend didn't make it out. The officer looked again at the chains. Look, he said, apparently deciding to give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't know how you got in there in the first place, and right now I don't want to know. But the machinery in there is old. It hasn't been touched in 10 years. Chances are it's pretty spooky. Heck, I wouldn't go in there. I wouldn't want to go in there. So even though I can't blame you for being freaked out, I can guarantee you those robots in there aren't moving by themselves. That place is dead, and it needs to be left alone, he said with a forced chuckle. Jason set his jaw, but he didn't say anything. I think you all need to go home, Dunn finished the statement without sounding more like a threat than advice. They looked at one another. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, Jessica looked to Charlie. These chains weren't here before, right? She faltered, looking back at her friends for confirmation like she was beginning to doubt on her own memory. No, Charlie said instantly. They weren't. We aren't leaving. We need your help. Fine, Dunn said shortly. What's his name? He produced a notebook seemingly from nowhere. Carlton Burke, Jessica said. She was about to spell it for him when suddenly Officer Dunn put down his pen and closed his eyes, his nostril flaring. He glared at them, no longer looking quite so young. I'm going to give you one more chance. Tell me exactly what happened. He spoke slowly, emphasizing the spaces between his words. He was in control again, no longer out of his depth, and like he suddenly understood everything. They tried to explain all at once, talking over one another. Jessica's voice was the loudest and calmest, but even she could not keep her anxiety from bleeding through. Charlie hung back quiet. Tell me exactly what happened. Where were they supposed to start? With the night? With the week? With Michael? With the first time her father picked up a circuit board? How was anyone ever to respond to something like, tell me what happened? The cop was nodding, and he picked up the radio again, but this time he spoke comprehensively. Nora, call Burke. It's his kid. I'm up. Nora, call Burke. It's his kid. I'm up at the old mall site. There was an answering burst of static, and the officer turned his attention back to him. Come on, he said. Come on where? John said. Off the property. Marla started to protest, but Dunn interrupted. I'm escorting you off the property, he said. He pulled the baton from his belt and pointed with it. Come on, Lamar said. Jason was still staring suddenly at the ground, and Lamar gave him a gentle nudge on the shoulder. Jason, come on. We have to do what he says now, okay? But Carlton, Jason said loudly, and Lamar shook his head. I know, it's okay, we'll find him, but we have to go now. He guided Jason toward the mouth of the alley, and everyone followed. The police officer walked behind, following Charlie a little too closely. She sped up, but so did he, and she resigned herself to being shadowed. When they got to the parking lot, he directed them to wait by the car and walked off a few paces, speaking to the radio again, too far away to hear. What's going on? Jason said. He was beginning to whine. He heard the tone in his voice and tried to modulate it. I'm not a little kid, he reminded himself. No one answered, but Marla rubbed his back absently, and he did not move away. Long minutes passed in silence. Jessica sat on the hood of the car, facing away from the rest of the group. Charlie wanted to go to her, but she did not. In her distress, Jessica was closing down, going stiff and cold and snippy, and Charlie did not think she had what it took to break through that without breaking down herself. Was he talking about Carlton's dad? Charlie asked, but no one had the time to answer. Headlights appeared, and a car pulled in beside them. The man who got out was tall and thin, and his light hair could have been either blonde or gray. Carlton's dad, Marla whispered, a late answer to Charlie's question. The man smiled as he approached. Carlton's dad, he confirmed. Though since you're all grown up now, you'd better call me Clay. They all muttered it, half in greeting, half just to test it out. Jason covered his mouth self-consciously, tonguing the invisible gap in his molars. I thought our days of mischief would be behind us. Behind us, no? Clay said, his expression good-humored. Jessica slid off the hood of Charlie's car, her face drawn. I'm so sorry he is missing, she said tightly. I don't know what happened. He was right with us. Bonnie kidnapped him, Jason burst out. I saw! The rabbit took him. Clay started to smile, then stopped himself when he saw their faces. Oh, kids, I'm sorry. You haven't been around in a while. I'm afraid Carlton is playing a joke on you. All of you. What? Lamar said. Oh, come on. With you guys back in town? He couldn't resist, Clay said. Whatever happened, I guarantee he set it up. He'll probably pop out of the bushes any time now. There was a silence as they all waited against probability. Nothing happened. Well, Clay said at last, that would have been too much to ask. Come on, why don't you come back to our place? I'll make you all some hot chocolate, and when Carlton finally shows up, you can tell him he's grounded. Okay, Charlie said, without waiting for the consent of the others. She wanted to believe Clay, wanted to believe that Carlton was all right, and would show up laughing. But almost as badly, she wanted to go somewhere where an adult was in charge. Someone who would make hot chocolate and assure there was no such thing as monsters. Assure them there was no such thing as monsters. Her father had never made that claim. Her father could never have told her that lie. No one objected, and so they started up their caravan again, trailing Clay home. They all settled into their accustomed places. Charlie, John, and Jessica in Charlie's car, and Marla, Jason, Lamar, and Marla's. In the rearview mirror, Charlie saw Officer Dunn's car still right behind them. Is he just going this way, or is he making sure we go where we're told? He wondered. But it didn't really matter. They weren't planning on flight. At Carlton's house, they filed in through the front door. Charlie looked back in time to see the police car drive on by. He was following us as they climbed the steps. John leaned in to the whisper in her ear. I didn't realize how rich they were when I was a kid, he said, and she stifled a laugh. It was true. The house was enormous. It was 3 stories high, and it sprawled out into the woods that it surrounded it. So wide that Charlie thought there must have been whole rooms where you could see out the window was trees. Clay showed them to the living room, which looked well used, the furniture mismatched, and the rugs dark and durable made to take stains. Carlton's mom, who you can call Betty now, is asleep, Clay said. The soundproofing is pretty good, just don't shout or crash around. They chorused promises, and he nodded. Satisfied and vanished through a doorway. They dispersed themselves over the furniture, sitting on couches and chairs. Charlie sat on the rug between Jessica's chair and Lamar's. She wanted them all to stay close together. John sat down beside her and gave a little smile. Did we get pranked? Marla asked. I guess maybe. I'm not sure what else would explain it. Jessica said listlessly, staring into the empty fireplace. I mean, none of us even knows each other that well. Not really. Maybe he would do something like that. They all shifted uncomfortably. It was true. They had been behaving as if their time apart were just a little break. Like they could just fill one another in on what they had been up to. And it would be just like it was, like their group had never split up. But 10 years was too long for that to be true, and deep down everyone knew it. Charlie darted her eyes at John. She felt a little embarrassed, but she could not have expressed why. Clay came back in, carrying a tray of steamed mugs and a little bag of marshmallows. Here you are, he said jovially. Hot chocolate for everyone, even me. He set the tray down on the coffee table and took a seat in a battered green armchair that seemed to fit him like a coat. As accustomed to his body, he was to its form. They reached forward and took the cups. Only Jason reached for the marshmallows. Clay looked around from face to face. Look, he said, I know you don't believe me, but Carlton does things like this, although I have to admit, this is probably the weirdest. It's not right. Making you all relive all that stuff from when you were kids? He stared into his mugs for a moment. I need to have another talk with them, he said quietly. Believe me, my son has a strange sense of humor, he went on. You know, for high school, we sent him to a place in the next town over. No one knew him. He managed to convince his classmates and his teachers that he had a twin brother at the school for the first month of class. I don't know how on earth he managed it, but I didn't find out until he got tired of the act and I started getting calls from school that one of my sons has gone missing. Charlie smiled weakly, but she was not convinced. This was different. This is different, Marla said. As if reading Charlie's thoughts, Jason saw him disappear. He was terrified. It's cruel if it's a prank. Marla shook her head with anger and scratched her nails against the porcelain cup. If it's a prank, she repeated in a softer tone. She looked at Charlie, her face stormy, and Charlie knew that if Carlton had in fact set all of this up, Marla would never speak to him again. Their happy reunion was over. Yes, Clay said, I know, but he doesn't see it that way. He took a sip of cocoa, searching for words. The twins, they had totally different personalities. Sean was this outgoing, cheerful guy. He was on the debate team. He played soccer, for goodness sake. Carlton had never got near a sports game without being forced. I don't know how he kept it up. Still, Marla said, but she sounded less convinced. The worst part was, Clay went on, talking more to himself now than to his teenagers. Sean had a girlfriend. She really liked him too, but he was just playing the part. Poor girl had been dating a guy who didn't even exist. I think he was surprised when he realized how upset people were. He gets carried away and just assumes everyone is having as much fun as he is. Charlie looked at John, and he met her glare anxiously. We don't know each other, not really. Maybe he did set it up, she said aloud. Maybe, Jessica echoed. I saw him. Sorry. I saw him, Jason said loudly. Before anyone could respond, he stormed out of the room, disappearing through a doorway. Marla stood automatically and moved to follow him, but Clay put up a hand. Let him go, he said. He needs some time to himself, and I want to talk to the rest of you. He set his mug down and leaned forward. I know you were just kidding around, but I don't want to hear you kids joking about Freddy Fazbear's. You know, I wasn't the chief back then, but I was still a detective, and I was working on those disappearances. To this day, it was the worst thing I have ever had to see. It's not something to joke about. He looked at Charlie. His gray eyes were hard, and the lines on his face were immobile. He was no longer the friendly father figure, but the police chief, staring as if he could right through her. Charlie had a sudden urge to confess, but she had nothing to confess to. I'm actually surprised at you, Charlie, Clay said quickly. Charlie blushed, shame rising up in her with the flush of heat. She wanted to protest, to explain herself, to say anything that might soften the eyes that seemed to bore into her skull. Instead, she ducked her head and muttered an indistinct apology. Lamar broke the silence. Mr. Burke, Clay, did they ever find out who did it? I thought they arrested somebody. Clay didn't respond for a long minute. He was still looking at Charlie, and she felt as if he were trying to tell her something, or else read something in her face. Clay, Marla said, and he seemed to come back to himself. He looked around the group, his expression dark. My throat's getting dry, sheesh. Yes, he said quietly. We did arrest someone. I did. In fact, I am as sure as now that he was guilty as I was then. So what happened? Lamar asked. There was a hush among the group as if something very important was about to happen. There were no bodies, Clay Burke said. We knew it was him. There was no doubt in my mind, but the children had disappeared. They were never found, and without their bodies... he stopped talking, staring off in the middle of the distance as if scarcely aware that they were there. But kidnapping, Charlie said. They disappeared. She was suddenly furious, appalled at the obvious injustice. How can this man be walking around somewhere? What if he does it again? She felt Marla's hand on her arm, and she nodded, settling back, trying to calm down, but the anger was still there, seething under the surface of her skin. Clay was looking at her with something like curiosity in her eyes. Charlie, he said, justice penalizes the guilty, but it must also protect the innocent. It means that sometimes the guilty get away with terrible things, but it is the price we pay. He sounded grave, his words weighty. Charlie opened her mouth to argue, but this was my price, she wanted to say. But before she spoke, she looked at his face. He had a grim conviction about him. What he was saying mattered very much to him, and he believed it utterly. It's how you sleep at night, she thought, with an uncharacteristic bitterness. They locked eyes for a moment, then Charlie sighed and nodded, giving up the challenge. Intellectually, she didn't even disagree with him. Clay sat up suddenly in his chair. So, he said brightly, I think it's a bit too late for you girls to be driving back to that motel. Why don't you spend the night here? We have 2 more guest rooms. And you can scold Carlton for his little prank in the morning, he added with a grin. Lamar and John showed Charlie, Marla, and Jessica up to the bedrooms, and Jason reemerged as they headed up the stairs, joining the group like he had never been gone. So Jason and I will take this one, Marla said, and Jessica, you and Charlie can have the other. I want to stay with Lamar, Jason said instantly, and Lamar grinned widely before he could help himself. Yeah, okay, he said. He glanced at Marla over her brother's head, and she shrugged. Take him, she said. Keep him if you want, so that means someone gets her own room. She went on, or we could all stay together. I know everything is fine, but I kind of feel like we should stay together. She was voicing Charlie's precise thoughts from only a little while before, but now Charlie jumped in. I'll take the other room, she said. Marla gave her a dubious look, and even John looked a little surprised, but Charlie just looked at them and said nothing. When the door closed behind her, Charlie said with relief. She went to the window, and it was as she imagined, nothing in the view but trees. The house seemed completely isolated, though she knew that the driveway and the road were just on the other side. From outside she could hear nocturnal birds and the rustling of other large creatures on the ground below. She felt suddenly restless, wide awake. Looking out the window, she almost wanted to go outside, to slip into the woods and see what they concealed. She looked at her watch. It was long past midnight, so with reluctance she took off her shoes and lay down on the bed. It was like everything else in Carlton's house, well worn. The kind of furniture only owned by people who have been wealthy for generations, whose ancestors could afford things of such high quality that they lasted for 100 years. Charlie closed her eyes in what she assumed would be a futile effort to find rest. But as she lay there, listening to the sound of the woods, and Jessica and Marla gossiping and laughing in the next room, she felt as if she were sinking into the mattress. Her breath deepened, and she was soon asleep. She woke suddenly, startled from sleep. She was a little girl again, and her father was asleep in the next room. It was summer, and the windows were all open. It had started to rain, and the wind rushed into the room in great gusts, blowing her bedroom curtains in a frenetic dance and ushering in a fine mist. But that was not why she awoke. There was something in the air, something unshakable that gripped her. Something was very wrong. Charlie climbed out of the bed, lowering herself carefully onto the floor. Beside her bed stood Stanley the unicorn, patient and deactivated, staring at her with lifeless eyes. She patted his nose, as if giving him a comfort might bring it to her as well. Quietly, she snuck past him and out into the out into the hallway, uncertain what compelled her. She crept down the hallway past her father's room to the stairs, and ducked down beside the wooden banister, as if its open slats could protect her from anything at all. She held fast to it as she made her way down the staircase, letting the rail take her weight as she avoided the boards that creaked. One by one, she took the steps. It felt like ages, like years might pass before she reached the bottom. And when she arrived, she might be an old woman, her whole life spun out in the descent of these stairs. At last, Charlie reached the end of the stairs, and she looked down to see that she had changed. Her body was no longer small, nightgown clad and barefoot, but her teenage body's tall, strong, and fully clothed. When she straightened from her fearful crouch, she stood taller than the banister, and she looked around at her childhood home, startled. This is me, she thought. Yes, this is now. Something banged in front of her. The front door was wide open and thudding irregularly against the wall, caught by the wind. The rain was whipping in, soaking the floor and lashing the coat rack that stood beside it, rocking it back and forth like it weighed nothing at all. Leaves and small branches were scattered on the floor, ripped from the trees and swept in. But Charlie's eyes went to her old familiar shoes, her favorites. They were placed neatly beside the matte black patent leather with straps, and she could see the rain pooling inside and ruining them. Charlie stood still for a moment, transfixed, too far for the rain to reach, but close enough for the haze to slowly wet her face. She ought to go to the door and close it. Instead, Charlie backed away slowly, not taking her eyes from the border of the storm. She took a step, then another, and her back hit something solid. She whirled around, startled, and saw it. It was the thing from her father's workshop, the terrible twitching thing. It stood on its own, bent and twisted, with a narrow, reddish, canine face and an almost human body. Its clothing was rags, its metal joints and limbs dark and exposed, but Charlie registered only its eyes, the silver eyes that flashed at her on and off, over and over, blinking in and out of existence. Charlie wanted to run, but her feet would not move. She could feel her the pulse in her throat choking her as she struggled to breathe. The thing convulsed, and in slow, jerky motions, its hand rose up and reached out to touch her face. Charlie drew in a shaking breath, unable to duck away, and then it stopped, the hand only inches from her cheek. Charlie braced herself, her breath shallow and her eyes screwed shut, but the touch of metal ragged cloth on her skin did not come. She opened her eyes. The thing had gone still, and the silver light in its eyes was dim, nearly out. Charlie backed away from it, watching warily, but it did not move, and she began to wonder if it had shut down, run out of the finite current that powered it. Its shoulders were hunched forward, hapless, and it started dully past her as if it were lost. Charlie felt a sudden stab of narrow for this creature. That same feeling of lonely kinship she felt in her father's workshop so many years ago. Does it hurt? She asked. She was old enough to know the answer. Wait, how many pages left in this chapter? Yeesh! I thought it was close to the end. All at once, the thing lurched to life. Charlie felt her hand go light as it took an awkward step towards her, hurtling its body forward as if it had only just leaned to walk. Its head turned frantically from side to side. Its arms jerked up and down with dangerous abandon. Something shattered. It was a lamp. The thing had knocked over a ceramic lamp, and the sound of it bursting on the wooden floor shook Charlie from her stupor. She turned and ran up the stairs, scrambling as fast as her legs would carry her to her father's door, too scared to even call out for him. As she clambered up the steps, some small part of her realized that they were too big, that she was nearly on all fours, tripping barefoot over the hem of her nightgown. She was a little girl again, she realized in a bursting movement of awareness, and then it was over, and being a little girl was the only thing she could remember. She tried again to scream for her father, but he was already there. She did not need to call him. He was standing in the hall, and she grabbed at his shirt tails, and as she crouched behind him, he put a hand over her shoulder, steadying her, and for the first time her father's touch did not make Charlie feel that she was safe. Okay. Peeking out from behind his back, Charlie could see the thing's ears, then its face, as if it climbed the stairs in its fitful, jerking steps. Her father stood calm, watching it as it climbed the final stair, and then Charlie's father grasped her hand and disentangled it, gently forcing her to let him go. He went forward to the thing in large, even strides, but as he reached out to it, Charlie could see that his hands were shaking. He touched the thing, put his hands on either side of its face for a long moment, as if he were caressing it. And its limbs stopped, head still moving gently from side to side. It looked almost bewildered, as if it too had awakened to something strange and frightening. Charlie's father did something she could not see, and the thing stopped moving. His head drooped, defeated, and its arms fell to its sides. Charlie backed up toward her room, feeling her way along the wall behind her, not daring to look away from the thing until she was safely behind her door. As she looked out one last time into the hallway, she could just barely see the glint of its eyes cast down on the floor. Suddenly, the little silver lights flickered. The head did not move. In a slow, calculated arch, the eyes swung to meet Charlie's gaze. Charlie whimpered, but she did not look away, and then the head snapped back up with a crack like something breaking. Charlie startled out of sleep, and an involuntary shudder running through her. She put a hand to her throat, feeling her heart beat there, too quick and too hard. She darted her eyes around the room, putting them together where she was, one piece at a time. The bed, not her own, the room. Dark. She was alone. The window, the woods outside. Carlton's house. Her breath slowed. The process had only taken seconds, but it disturbed her to be so disoriented. She blinked, but the afterburn of those silver eyes was still with her, glowing behind her eyelids as if they had been real. Charlie stood and went to the window, thrust it open, and leaned out, desperate to breathe in the night air. Did that happen? The dream felt like memory, felt like something that had happened just moments ago. But that was just the nature of dreams, wasn't it? They felt real, and then you woke up. She closed her eyes and tried to catch the thread, but it was too difficult to tell what was the dream and what was not. She shivered in the breeze, though it was not cold, and brought herself back inside. She looked at her watch. Only a couple of hours had passed. It was still hours more until daylight, but sleep felt impossible. Charlie put on her shoes and shuffled quietly through the hall and down the stairs, hoping not to wake her friends. She went out to the porch, sitting down on the front steps and leaning back to look up at the sky. There were traces of clouds overhead, but the stars still shone through, scattered overhead, uncountable. She tried to lose herself in them as she had as a child, but as she gazed up at the pinpoint lights, all she could see were eyes looking back at her. There was a noise behind her, and she jumped, whirling to press her back against the railing. John was standing behind her with a startled look on his face. They stared at each other for a moment like strangers, and then Charlie found her voice. "Hey, sorry, did I wake you up again?" John shook his head and came to sit beside her. No, not really. I heard you go out, or I figured it was you. I was awake, though. Jason snores like a guy about 3 times his size. Charlie laughed. I had a weird dream, she said. John nodded, waiting for her to go on, but she did not. What did people think of my father? She asked instead. John leaned back and looked at the stars for a moment, then pointed. That's Cassiopeia, he said, and she squinted in the direction of his finger. That's Orion, she corrected. John, I'm serious. What did people think about him? He shrugged uncomfortably. Charlie, I was a little kid, you know. Nobody told me anything. I was a little kid once myself, she said. Nobody tells you anything, but they talk in front of you like you're not there. I remember your mom and Lamar's mom talking, making bets on how long Marla's new stepdad would stick around. What did they come up with? John said, amused. Your mom was banking on 3 months. Lamar's mom was more optimistic, Charlie said, grinning, but then her face grew serious. I can tell you know something, she said quietly. After a few moments, he nodded. Some people thought he did, yeah, he admitted. What? Charlie was aghast. She stared at him, eyes wide, scarcely breathing. They thought what? They thought what? John glanced at her nervously. I thought that's what you were thinking, he said. Charlie shook her head. Some people thought he did it. I meant what did they think of him as a person? Did they think he was odd or kind of, I didn't know. She trailed off, lost in the magnitude of this new truth. People thought he did it. Of course they did. It was his restaurant. The first child to vanish was his child. In the absence of a confession or a conviction, who else would anyone think of? Charlie shook her head again. Charlie, John said hesitantly, I'm sorry, I just assumed... I just assumed you must have known people who think that, though, if not then now. Well, I didn't, she snapped. She felt a hollow satisfaction when she drew back hurt. She took a deep breath. I know it sounds obvious, she said in more even tones, but it just never occurred to me that anyone would think he was responsible. And then after he committed... But that would have only reinforced their suspicions, she realized as she said it. People thought it was because of the guilt, John said, almost to himself. It was, Charlie felt anger welling up inside her, the dam about to break, and she held it back, biting off words in short bursts. Of course he felt guilt. It was his restaurant, his life's work, his creations, and it was all turned into a massacre. Don't you think that's enough? Her voice sounded vicious, even to her own ears. Apologize, she thought, but she ignored it. People thought he did it. He wouldn't. He couldn't. But if he had, how would she have ever known? I knew him, she thought fiercely. But did she? She loved him, trusted him with the blind devotion of a 7-year-old girl. Even now, she understood him with the knowing and not knowing that comes of being a child. When you focus on your parent as if they were the center of the earth, that thing on which your survival depends, only later do you realize their flaws, their scars, and their weaknesses. Charlie had never had the dawning moments of realization as she grew older that her father was only human. She had never had the chance. To her, she was still mythic, still larger than life, still the man who could deactivate the monsters. He was also the man who made them. How well did she really know him? The rage was gone, had embedded back to wherever it rose from, and she was empty of it, her insides dry and vacant. She closed her eyes and put a hand to her forehead. I'm sorry, she said, and John touched her shoulder for a brief moment. Don't be, he said. Charlie put her hands over her face. She did not feel like crying, but she didn't want him to see her face. She was thinking of things that were too new, too awful to think in front of someone else. How would I have known if he did? Charlie? John cleared his throat and repeated her name. Charlie, you know he didn't do it, right? Mr. Burke said they knew who did it, but they had to let him go. He got away with it, remember? Charlie didn't move, but something like hope stirred inside her. It wasn't him, John said again, and she looked up. Right, of course it wasn't, she whispered. Of course it wasn't him, she said at a normal pitch. Of course not, he echoed. She nodded, bobbing her head up and down like she was gathering momentum. I want to go back to the house one more time, she said. I want you to come with me. Of course, he said. She nodded again and then turned her face back up to the sky. Alright, that was one chapter down, 2 more to go. Until the end of the stream. Now, let's see. What do you mean a minute, hour, 30 minutes? I'm not done yet. Alright. Just want to make sure the stream's okay. Okay, I'm still live. Good. Ugh. I don't know if my throat's drying up from the flakes of this. I don't see any. Let me see. I can't see them, but I can feel them. Like little tiny traces of paper whirling in the wind. As if they're coming to my throat or something. Either way, I'm gonna get a drink. I'll be right back. I'm not done yet. I'm getting a drink. Be right back. Alright, I'm back. Right, yeah. Alright then. What? Hey! What happened to my drop? What's this? Okay, there we go. Still in the green. There we go. I panicked for a second. Oh, I didn't feel like I was panicking. Alright. Chapter 8. Charlie. Someone was at the door. Knocking loud enough to rattle the old hinges. Charlie roused slowly, her eyes sticky with sleep. But this time, at least she knew where she was. She had left the window open, and now the air coming in had a fresh, heavy smell. It was the scent of coming rain, mossy and rich. She got up and looked out the window, inhaling deeply. Unlike most of the world, the woods outside looked almost the same in the morning as they had in the dark. Bumped into the mic, sorry. Charlie and John had gone back to bed soon after they finished talking. John had looked at her like there was more he wanted to say, but she had pretended not to notice. She was grateful to him for being there, for giving her what she needed without having to ask, because she would never have asked. Charlie! The banging came again, and she gave in. I'm up, Marla, she shouted back. Charlie, now Jason, was joining in the game, knocking and rattling, and Charlie groaned and went to the door. I said I'm up, she said, mock glaring out at them. Charlie, Jason shouted again, and this time Marla shushed him. He grinned up at Charlie, and she laughed and shook her head. Believe me, I'm awake, she said. Marla was fully dressed, her hair a little damp from the shower, and her eyes were bright and alert. Are you always like this? Charlie said, her grumpiness only half invented. Like what? Chipper at 6 in the morning? She said, and rolled her eyes at Jason, who copied her, happy to be included. Marla smiled brightly. It's 8, come on. There's been talk of breakfast. Has there been a talk of coffee? Charlie followed Marla and Jason down the stairs to the kitchen, where she found Lamar and John already seated around a high, modern-looking wood table. Carlton's father was at the stove making pancakes. It smells like rain, Charlie said, and Lamar nodded. There's a thunderstorm coming, he said. It was on the news earlier, he told us. He jerked a thumb at Clay. It's a big one, Clay exclaimed in response. We're supposed to leave today, Jason said. We'll see, Marla said. Charlie, Clay cried, not taking his eyes off his work. 1, 2, or 3? 2, Charlie said. Thanks. Is there coffee? Help yourself. Mug's in the cupboard, Clay said, gesturing to a full pot on the counter. Charlie helped herself, waving off offers of milk, cream, half and half, sugar, or fake sugar. Thanks, she said quietly, as she settled herself beside Lamar, meeting John's eyes briefly. Did Carlton come in? Lamar shook his head, a tight jerk to the side. He hasn't turned up yet, Clay said. Probably isn't awake yet, wherever he is. He placed a full plate in front of Charlie, who dug in, not realizing how hungry she was until she was already chewing. She was about to ask where Carlton was likely to be when Jessica appeared, yawning, her clothes unrumpled unlike Charlie's. You're late, Marley teased, and Jessica stretched elaborately. I don't get out of bed until pancakes are ready, she said, and with impeccable timing, Clay slapped one onto a plate fresh off the pan. Well, you're just in time, he said. Suddenly his expression changed, wavering somehow between apprehension and relief. Charlie turned in her seat. There was a woman standing behind her, dressed in a gray skirt suit, her blonde hair shellacked against her head as if it were a plastic toy. Are we a Waffle House now? She asked. She looked around the kitchen briefly. Pancakes, Jessica correctly, but no one responded. Betty, Clay cried. You remember the boys, and this is Charlie, Jessica, and Marla, and Jason. He pointed to each in turn, and Carlton's mother gave each of them a nod like she was tallying them up. Clay, I have to be in court in an hour. Betty's the DA for the county. Clay went on as if he had not heard her. I catch the crooks, she puts them back out on the streets. Yes, our family is a full-service operation, she said dryly, pouring out herself coffee and settling down at the table beside Jessica. Speaking of which, where's our young felon to be? Clay hesitated. Another one of his pranks, he said. He'll be back home later, I'm sure. Their eyes met and something private passed between them. Betty broke away with a laugh that sounded a little forced. Oh Lord, what is it this time? There was a moment's pause in the morning light. The story sounded insane, and Charlie had no idea where to begin. With a nervous clearing of his throat, Lamar started to explain. We went up to the small construction site to go see what was left of Freddy Fazbear's. At the name, Betty's head jerked up and she gave a quick nod. Go on, she said, her voice suddenly cold and clipped. Lamar explained awkwardly, and Marla and Jason jumped in with the details. After a few minutes, Carlton's mother had a messy version of the truth, and she listened, her face hardened until it looked like plaster. She was a statue of herself. She shook her head as they finished, small rapid movements, and Charlie thought she looked like she was not trying to deny what they were saying, but to shake the knowledge entirely from her mind. You have to go get him, Clay, right now, she demanded. Send someone. How could you wait all night? She set her coffee on the table more forcefully than she should have, smelling a little, then went to the phone and started dialing. Who are you calling? Clay said, alarmed. The police, she snapped. I am the police. Then why are you here instead of finding my son? Clay opened and closed his mouth helplessly for a moment before finding its bearings. Betty, it's just another joke. Remember the frogs? She set the phone back on its hook and turned to face him, her eyes smoldering. Charlie could suddenly see her standing right just before a jury, wreaking the wrath of the law. Clay, her voice was low and steady, a dangerous calm. How could you not wake me up? How could you not tell me this? Betty, you were asleep. It's just Carlton being Carlton. I didn't want to disturb you. Did you think I would be less disturbed when I woke up and found him missing? I thought he would be back by now, Clay protested. This is different, she said with finality. It's Freddy's. I don't understand Freddy's. I know what happened there, what happened to those kids, he retorted. I don't understand? For goodness sake, Betty, I saw Michael's blood streaked across the floor where he was dragged off from... He stopped, realizing too late that he was surrounded by the teenagers. He looked around at them, near panic, but his wife had not noticed, or Charlie she just did not care. Well, you didn't see him, Betty snapped. Do you remember what you told Carlton? Be tough, be brave, little soldier? So he was brave. He was a little soldier for you. He was shattered, Clay. He had lost his best friend, had Michael snatched away right in front of him. Let me tell you something, Chief. That boy has thought about Michael every single day of his life for the last 10 years. I have seen him stage jokes so elaborate they deserve to be mounted as performance art pieces. But there is no way on earth that Carlton would desecrate Michael's memory by making Freddy's a joke. So, call someone right now. Clay looked slightly shocked, but he gathered himself quickly and left the room. Charlie heard a door slam shut behind him. Betty looked around at the teenagers, breathing hard as if she had been running. Everything is going to be fine, she said tightly. If he is trapped in there, we will get him out. What do you kids have planned for the day? The question was insane. As if they were all going to hang out at the park or go to a movie while Carlton might be in danger. We were supposed to leave today, Marla said. Obviously we won't, Lamar said, hastily. But Betty did not seem to be listening to them. I'll have to call in to work, she said, distractedly, and went to the phone to make the call. Charlie looked at John, who jumped to the rescue. We were going to the library, he said. We had some things we wanted to investigate. Research. He blushed faintly when he said it, and Charlie knew why. It was absurd to be talking like this, about cases and disappearances and murders, but Marla was nodding. Yeah, we'll all go, she said, and Charlie's heart sank. There was no reason she couldn't just tell them all that she wanted to go back to her old house. Just her and John. No one would be hurt. But that wasn't the problem. Even sharing the knowledge felt too much like exposure. Carlton's mother hung up the phone, done with her call. I hate this, she announced to her room in general, her careful, controlled voice almost shaken. I hate this! Charlie and the others jumped in unison, startled by the sudden outburst. And now, like always, I get to sit here by myself, hoping and praying that everyone will be okay. Charlie looked at Marla, who shrugged helplessly. Lamar cleared his throat nervously. I think we'll stick around for another day, he said. There was a pause, then Marla and Jessica jumped in to help. Yeah, traffic is crazy out there, Jessica said, high-pitched and forced. Yeah, and also because of the storm, and it's not like we're going to have fun knowing he's missing, Marla said. I guess you're stuck with us, Jessica flashed, an anxious smile at Carlton's mother, who did not seem to register it. Come on, John said. Before anyone else could speak, he and Charlie hurried out of the house and got into the car. Charlie heaved a sigh of relief as she started the engine. "That was awful," she said. "Yeah." He gave her a worried look. "What do you think about Carlton?" Charlie didn't answer until she was safely back out in the driveway. "I think his mom is right," she said, pulling into gear. "I think last night we let all ourselves believe what we wanted to believe." Officer Dunn pulled to a stop in the parking lot, responding to Chief Burke's order to return. In the light of day, it was just an abandoned construction site, an ugly blemish on the flat desert landscape. You can't tell from looking at if it's being built up or torn down, Dunn thought. Can't tell a creation from destruction at a distance. He liked the phrase. He turned it over in his head for a moment. Staring at the place, on impulse, he radioed dispatch. "Hey, Nora," he said. "Done?" "Done," she answered crisply. "What's going on?" "Back at the ball for another look," he said. "Ooh, bring me back a soft pretzel," she teased. He laughed and broke the connection. As he walked briskly through the mall, Dunn was at least grateful the children were not there this time. As the youngest member of the Hurricane Police Department, Dunn always took care to think of teenagers and his children, even though he knew how small the gap between them was. If he could bring them to believe he was a responsible adult, hopefully at some point he would believe it too. Dunn flipped on his flashlight and he searched the entrance to the narrow alleyway that led to Freddy Fazbear's. He swept up the bean up and down the walls ahead of him, but the alley was empty of life. He took a deep breath and went in. Dunn kept to the wall, his shoulders brushing lightly against the rough brick as he tried to avoid the puddles that pooled beneath the leaky pipes. The bright beam of his flashlight illuminated the alley almost as well as overhead bulbs, but somehow the light was not confronting. It only made the place look stark and grim, the shelves of tools and rejected paint cans now woeful and exposed. As he moved toward the door to the restaurant, something tiny and cold landed on his head, and he startled, swinging his light up like a weapon and pressed his back against the wall as defense against the threat. Another cold drop of water landed on his cheek. He took deep breaths. When at last he reached the outer door to the restaurant, the shelf that had blocked it was gone. The chains that had seemed so permanently fixed in place were hanging loose, and the door cracked open slightly. The immense rusted padlock lay in the dirt, its shackle hanging open. Dunn kicked it away from the door. He dug his fingers into the gap, prying until he could get a grip on it. Then he pulled at the door with both hands until it screeched open wide enough for him to enter. He crept out the inner passage with his light held out in front, hugging the wall tight to one side. The air seemed to change as he moved closer to the interior of the restaurant, and Dunn felt a crawling chill that penetrated his uniform and fed his growing anxiety. "Don't freak out, Dunn," he said out loud, then felt instantly foolish. He reached the main dining area and stopped, sweeping the light over each wall in turn. The light seemed dimmer inside, swallowed by the space. The room was empty, but it was just as he remembered from when he was a kid. He had been 10 when the tragedy started, 11 when they ended. His birthday party was supposed to be at Freddy's, but after the first disappearance, his mother had canceled it, invited his friends to his house, and hired a clown, which proved equally terrifying. "Smart move, Mom," Dunn thought. The beam played over the little carousel, which he had never ridden. Claiming he was too old for it, just before the beam of light reached the stage, Dunn stopped, swallowing hard. "The rabbit took him," the kid had said. Dunn shook himself and played the light across the stage. The figures were there, just as he remembered, and unlike the carousel, they did not seem diminished in size. They were exactly as he recalled. For a moment, an almost painful nostalgia swelled in his chest. As he gazed at them, remembering, he noticed that their eyes were all fixed oddly forward, like they were watching something on the far side of the room. The flashlight trained in front of him. Dunn approached the stage until he was standing only a few feet from it, and he started up at each of the animals in turn. Bonnie was holding his guitar jauntily, as if he might begin to strumming whenever the mood struck him, and Chica and her cupcake seemed to be sharing some arcane secret. Freddy, with his microphone, stared out into the distance, unblinking. Something moved behind him, and Dunn whirled around, his heart racing. The flashlight found nothing, and he swept it nervously from side to side, revealing only empty tables. He glanced back nervously at Bonnie, but the rabbit was still frozen in its own inscrutable reverie. Dunn took shallow breaths, holding himself completely still, and listened. His senses kicked into high gear with adrenaline. After a moment, the noise came again, a shuffling sound, this time coming from off to the right. He swept the light instantly towards it. There was an open doorway, and beyond it, a hall. Crouching down, Dunn made his way down the hall, keeping it to the side as though something might come running past. Why am I here alone? He knew the answer. His sergeant hadn't taken the search seriously. In truth, neither had Dunn. After all, it was just the chief's son again making trouble. It was probably just Carlton, Dunn reminded himself. He reached the end of the hall where a door stood ajar. With one hand, Dunn gave the door an inward push, dropping low and to the side as he did. The door swung inward and nothing happened. He pulled the nightstick from his belt. Its heft was unfamiliar. He had never had much need for it in Hurricane. Now, though, he gripped its hard rubber handle like a lifeline. The office was not quite empty. There was a small desk and a folded-up metal chair leaned against it. A large cabinet stood against one wall, and its door opened just a crack. There was no exits other than the one Dunn was standing in. He swept the light up and down the length of the cabinet and took a deep breath. He bounced his nightstick lightly in his hand, reassuring himself of its presence, and carefully assessed the small space standing to the side. He used the stick to open the door, moving slowly. It came open easily, and again everything was still. Relieved, Dunn looked inside. The cabinet was empty except for a costume. It was Bonnie, or rather, it wasn't. The face was the same, but the rabbit's fur was yellow. It slumped lifelessly against the back wall of the cabinet, its eyes dark gaping holes. The rabbit took him. The kid hasn't been lying. Then Carlton must have gotten someone to dress up in this outfit to help him play his trick. Still, Dunn's unease did not abate. He did not want to touch the thing. He lowered his light and struck his nightstick back to his belt, intending to go. But before he could turn, the costume pitched forward, landing on Dunn with the lifeless weight of a heavy corpse. For a moment, it did not move. Then, all at once, it was writhing violently, grabbed at him with strong, inhumane hands. Dunn screamed, a desperate high sound struggling as the rabbit gripped his shirt, then his arm. Dunn suddenly felt a vicious pain, and a small, detached part of his mind thought, "He broke it! He broke my arm!" But the pain was washed numb by terror as the rabbit swung him around and slammed him into the cabinet door, taking Dunn's weight easily as if he were a child. Dunn struggled to breathe. The rabbit's arm was pressed against his neck so tightly that every moment choked him. Just when he thought he was on the brink of passing out, the pressure lifted, and Dunn gasped with relief, clutching his throat. Then he saw the knife. The rabbit held a slim silver blade. Its big, matted paws should have been too clumsy, but Dunn knew as he started down at it that the rabbit had done this before, and would easily do it again. Dunn screamed, an indistinct shriek. He had no hope that he would be heard. It was only a guttural, despairing noise. He breathed deep and did it again, and a bestial sound, his whole body vibrating with it, as if this could somehow be defense against what happened next. The knife went in. Dunn felt it tear through his skin and muscle, felt it sever things he could not name to plant itself deep in his chest. As he seized with pain and terror, the rabbit pulled him close, almost in an embrace. Dunn's head went light. He was losing consciousness, and he looked up. He could see 2 rows of smiling teeth, horrid and yellow, the costume peeling at the edges of the mouth. 2 gaping holes for eyes looked down at him. They were dark and hollow, but the creature drew near enough that Dunn could see smaller eyes peering back at him from deep within the mask. They held Dunn's gaze patiently. Dunn felt his legs go numb, his vision clouding. He wanted to scream again to somehow voice his final outrage, but he could not move. His face could not raise the breath to cry out. The rabbit held him upright, supporting his weight, and its eyes were the last thing Dunn had ever saw. Wow, that took a turn for the worst. I'm assuming Carlton... I don't know if Carlton's dead or alive, but Dunn certainly sure as hell is. Charlie unlocked the front door to her old house and looked back down... Wait, this is all in the same chapter! Charlie unlocked the front door to her old house and looked back down the front steps. You coming? John was still standing on the bottom steps, staring up at the house. He shivered a little before hurrying to join her. Sorry, he said sheepishly. I had just had a weird feeling for a second, Charlie laughed without much humor. Just for a second? They went inside, and John stopped again, looking around the front room like he had just stepped into a sacred place, somewhere that merited a humbling pause. Charlie bit her tongue, trying not to be impatient. It was how she had felt as well. She might have felt that way now if she were not overwhelmed by a sense of urgency. The feeling that the answer to everything, the answer to how to get Carlton back, must be somewhere in this place. Where else could it possibly be? John, she said, it's okay, come on. He nodded and followed her up the stairs to the second floor. He stopped again briefly halfway up, and Charlie saw his eyes fixed on the dark stain that marred the wooden floor of the living room. He began to say, then swallowed it up over and over. Is Stanley still here? Charlie pretended not to notice the lapse. You remember his name? She said instead, grinning. John shrugged. Who doesn't love a mechanical unicorn? Yeah, he's still there. All the toys still work. Come on. They hurried the rest of the way to her room. John knelt down beside the uniform and pressed the button that set him on his track, watching rapidly as he made his squeaky way around the room. Charlie hid a smile behind her hand. John was watching intently, his face serious as if something very important were happening. For a moment, he looked just like he had so many years ago, his hair falling into his face, his whole attention fixed on Stanley, like nothing in the world was more important than this robotic creature. Suddenly, his attention was called upward, and his face lit up as he pointed. Your big girl closet. It's open, it exclaimed, getting back to his feet and approaching the tallest of the 3 closets, which was hanging open slightly. Your big girl closet, it's open. Okay, I'm still good here. Let me see. Okay, he pulled it open all the way, then leaned in, finding it empty. So what was in it all those years, he asked. Not sure, Charlie said with a shrug. I sort of remember Aunt Jen bringing me back at some point, but I could be wrong. Maybe it was full of clothes that I was finally big enough to wear. Aunt Jen was always thrifty. Why spend money on new clothes if you don't have to, right? She smiled, sorry. John glanced briefly at the smaller closets, but he left them alone. I'm going to see if I can find any photo albums or paperwork, Charlie said, and she nodded absently as Stanley rattled back to his starting point. As she left the room, she heard him starting up again, making another round on the track. The room that had been her father's was next to Charlie's. It was at the back of the house, and it had too many windows in the summer. It was too hot, and in the winter, the cold dribbled in like a persistent leak. But Charlie had known without being told why he used it. From here, you could see the garage and his workshop, and it had always made sense to Charlie that it was his place, like a part of him always lived there, and he did not like to be too far away from his touchstone. Away from her dream came to her for a moment, not even an image, just a strange evocative gesture of a memory. She frowned, looking out the window at the closed, silent garage door. Or maybe he just wanted to be sure nothing goes out, she thought. She broke away from the window, shrugging her shoulders and shaking her hands, sliding off the feeling. She looked around the room like her own, it was all but untouched. She did not open the drawers to her dresser, but for all she knew, it might have been filled with shirts and socks, cleaned and folded and ready to wear. His bed was made crisply covered in the plaid blanket he used as a bedspread after Charlie's mother left. When there was no one to insist on white linen, there was a large bookcase against one wall, and it was still stuffed with books. Charlie went over and began scanning the shelves. Many were textbooks, engineering tomes, and those titles meant nothing to her. And the rest were non-fiction, a collection that would have seemed eclectic to anyone who did not know the man. There were books on biology and anatomy, some on human beings and others on animals. There were books about the history of the traveling carnival and of the circus. There were books about child development, about myths and legends, and about sewing patterns and techniques. There were volumes that claimed to be about trickster gods, about quilting bees, and about football cheering squads and their mascots. On the very top shelf were stacks of file folders, and the bottom shelf was empty except for a single book, a photo album, leather-bound and as pristine as time and dust could allow. Charlie grabbed it, and it stuck for a moment, almost too tall for the low shelf it had been given. After a minute, it came free, and she headed back to her bedroom, leaving the door open, with the sudden sense that if it closed, she might never get back in. John was sitting on the bed when she returned, looking at Stanley with his head tilted on the side. "What?" Charlie said, and he looked up still pensive. "I was wondering if he's been lonely," he said, then shrugged. "He's got Theodore," Charlie said, pointing to the stuffed rabbit with a smile. It's Ella who's all alone in the closet. Watch." She placed the album beside John on the bed and went to its foot. Then turned the wheel that set Ella on her track. She sat down beside him, and they watched together, spellbound as of old, as the little doll came out in her crisp, clean dress to blankly offer tea. Neither of them spoke until the smallest closet door closed behind her. John cleared his throat. "So what's in the book?" "Photos," Charlie said. I haven't looked at them yet." She picked up the album and opened it at random. The top picture was of her mother holding a baby, maybe a year old. She held the child above her head, flying it like an airplane, her head thrown back in the midst of a laugh, her long brown hair swinging out in an arch behind her. The baby's eyes were wide and its mouth in delight. John smiled at her. "You look so happy," he said, and she nodded. "Yeah," she said. "I guess I must have been. If that's me," she did not add aloud. She She opened to another page where the only picture was a large family portrait, stiffly posed at a studio. They were dressed formally. Charlie's father was wearing a suit, her mother was wearing a bright pink dress with padding that lifted her shoulders almost to her ears. And her brown hair was straightened flat in place. Each of them was holding a baby, one in a white frilly dress and one in a sailor suit. Charlie's heart skipped, and beside her, she heard John take a sharp, quick breath, and she looked at him with a feeling like the floor was dropping away beneath them. It was real, she said. I didn't imagine him. John said nothing in response, just nodded. He put a hand on her shoulder briefly, and then he turned back to the photo album. We all looked so happily, Charlie said softly. I think you were, John said. Look, you had such a goofy smile, he pointed, and Charlie laughed. The whole book was like that. The first memories of a happy family who expected there to be many more. They were not arranged chronologically, so Charlie and Sammy appeared as toddlers, then as newborns, then at various stages in between, except on formal occasions when Charlie was put into a dress, of which there seemed to be few. It was impossible to tell which baby was which. There were no traces of Fredbear's family diner. Near the back of the book, Charlie came to a Polaroid of her and Sammy together, infants bright red and squalling on their backs, wearing nothing but diapers and hospital wristbands. On the white space below the picture, someone had written Mama's Boy and Daddy's Girl. The rest of the pages were blank. Charlie went back again, opening at a random to find a strip from a photo booth. 4 shots of her parents alone. They smiled at each other, then made faces at the camera, then laughed, missing the chance to pose and blurring their faces. Lastly, they smiled into the lens. Her mother was beaming happily at the camera, her face alight and flushed. But her father was staring into the distance, a smile fixed on his face, like he had left it there by mistake. His dark eyes were intense, remote, and Charlie resisted a sudden urge to look behind her, as if she might see whatever it was he was looking at. She peeled back the cellophane from the album's page and took the strip out, then folded it in half carefully to place the crease between pictures, leaving them intact. She slipped the pictures in her pocket and looked at John, who was watching her again as if she were some kind of unpredictable creature he needed to be careful around. What? She said. Charlie, you know I don't think he did it, right? You said that. I'm serious. It's not just what Carlton's dad said. I knew him. As well as a kid can know some other kids' dads. He wouldn't do it. I wouldn't believe it. He spoke with a calm certainty, like someone who believed that the world was made out of facts and tangible things, that there was such a thing as truth. Charlie nodded. I know, he said. She took her next breath, slowly gathering the words she would speak with it. But I might, his eyes widened, startled, and he looked up at the ceiling for a minute, briefly trying to remember if all the cracks had been there when she was a child. I don't mean I think he did it. I don't think that, she said. I don't think about it at all. I can't. I shut the whole thing off my mind the day I left Hurricane. I don't think about Freddy's. I don't think about what happened, and I don't think about him. John was looking at her like she was monstrous, like what she was saying was the worst thing he had ever heard. I don't understand how you could say things like that, he said quietly. You loved him. How can you even consider the possibility that he would do something so terrible? Even the people who do terrible things have people who love them. Charlie was looking for words. I don't think he did it. I'm not saying that. She said again and again. The words hit the air as flimsy as paper. But I remember him dressing up for us in the yellow Freddy suit, doing the dances, miming along with the songs. It was so much a part of him. He was the restaurant. There was no one else. And he was always so distant, like in that picture. There was always something else going on beneath the surface. It was like he had a real life and a secret life, you know. John nodded and looked about to speak, but Charlie rushed on before he could. We were the secret life. His real life was his work. It was what mattered. We were his guilty pleasure, the thing he got to love and sneak away to have time with, something he kept hidden away from the dangers of what he did in his real world. And when he was with us, there was always a part of him that was back in reality, whatever that was for him. Again, John opened his mouth, but Charlie snapped the photo album shut, stood up, and left the room. John didn't follow her right away, and as she traveled to the short hall to her father's bedroom, she could almost hear him making up his mind. Not waiting for him, she went to the bookshelf, wanting to get the book out of her hands. Like maybe if it were closed up and put away, her mind too would return to its normal order. The book would not fit, and she dropped her knees to get a better angle, trying to jam the thing back where it belonged. Get it out of her hands. The shelf seemed to have shrunk down while she was gone, so that it could never be returned, never put right. With a cry of frustration, Charlie shoved the photo album in as hard as she could. The shelf rocked back and then forward, with a sudden mass of papers and file folders tumbling from above her. Charlie began to cry as pages drifted down around her, covering the floor like snow, and she wept. Swiftly, John was there. She knelt down with her in the delicate wreckage, clearing papers away as quickly as he could, without tearing them. He put a hand on her shoulder carefully, and she did not move away. She pulled her close and held her, and she hugged him. And she hugged him back, grabbing so tight she knew she must be hurting him. But she could not let go. She sobbed harder, as if being held, being contained, made it safe to let go. Long minutes passed. John stroked her hair, and Charlie still cried, her body shaking with the force of it, shuddering like she was possessed. She was not thinking of what happened, not flitting from one memory to the next to mourn for them all. Her mind was all but blank. She held nothing, was nothing, but this feeling of racking sobs. Her face was sore with tension, her chest hurt like all her pain was being forced out through its wall, and she still cried as if she would cry forever. But forever was an illusion. Slowly, her breathing calmed, and finally Charlie returned to her and pushed away from John's shoulder. Exhausted once again, John was left with his arms partially suspended in the air, caught off guard by their sudden emptiness. Wrong mouse. He tried to move out of the awkward pose without calling attention to himself. Charlie sat back against the side of her father's bed, leaning her head against it. She felt wrung out and stretched thin and aged, but she felt a little better. She gave John a tiny smile, and she saw her relief pass over his face. At this first sign, she might be all right. I'm okay, she said. It's just this place. It's all this, she said. Felt silly trying to explain, but John scooted back to sit with her. Charlie, you don't have to explain. I know what happened. Do you? She looked at him searchingly, not sure how to put the question. It seemed too crude, too graphic to say it outright. Do you know how my dad died, John? He looked immediately nervous. I know he killed himself, he said hesitantly. No, I mean, do you know how? Oh. John looked at his feet as if he could not meet her eyes. I thought he stabbed himself, he said quietly. I remember hearing my mom and dad talk. She had something about a knife and all the blood. There was a knife, Charlie said, and there was blood. She closed her eyes and kept them shut as she talked. She could feel John's eyes on her face, watching every movement, but she knew if she looked at him, she would not be able to finish. I never saw it, she said. I never saw the body. I don't know if you remember, but my aunt came to get me at school in the middle of the day. She stopped waiting for confirmation, her eyes shut tight. I remember John's voice said from the darkness, it was the last time I ever saw you. Yeah, She came and got me, and I knew something was wrong. You don't go home from school in the middle of the day because everything's fine. She took me outside to her car, but we didn't get in right away. She picked me up and set me on the hood of her car, and she told me she loved me. I love you, Charlie, and everything is going to be okay, Aunt Jen said, and then she destroyed the world within the next words she spoke. She told me that my father had died, and she asked if I knew what that meant. And Charlie nodded because she did know, and because with an awful prescience, she was not surprised. She said I was going to stay with her for a couple days, and she would go get some clothes from the house. When we got there, she picked me up like I was a little kid, and as we went through the door, she covered my face with her hand so I wouldn't see what was in the living room. But I did see. It was one of the creatures, one she had never seen, and it was facing the stairs. Its head was bowed a little so that Charlie could see that the back of its skull was open, the circuits exposed, the limbs and joints lay bare, a skeleton of naked metal strung of twisting wires and bloodless circulation, and its arms were outstretched in a lonesome facsimile of an embrace. It was standing in the middle of a dark, still pool of some liquid that seemed, though it must have been unperceptible to be spraying. She could see its face, if it could be called a face. Its features were scarcely formed, crude and shapeless. Even so, Charlie could see that they were contorted, almost grotesque. The thing would be weeping as if it could have wept. She stared at it for ages, and though it could have been less than seconds, no more than a glimpse, as Aunt Jen swept her up the stairs, and she had seen it so many times since then. When she slept, when she woke, when she unguardedly closed her eyes, it would appear to her, the face pressing its way into her mind, and it had pressed into the world. Its blind eyes were only raised bumps like the eyes of a statue, seeing nothing but its own grief. In its hand, and almost an afterthought, was a knife. Get out of here, you! Where'd it go? Go away. Blah, blah, blah. Was the knife. When Charlie saw the knife, the whole thing snapped into focus. She knew what the thing was. She knew what it had been built for. John was staring at her, horror creeping in. That's how he trailed off. Of course, Charlie nodded. Of course, he made a move to confront her again, but it was the worst thing to do. Without thinking, Charlie moved slightly, slipping out of reach, and his face fell. Sorry, she said quickly. Sorry. John shook his head quickly and turned to the jumble of papers of the floor. We should look through these, see if there's anything here, he said. Sure, she said briskly, dismissing his attempts at reassurance. They began randomly. Everything had fallen in such a mess that there was no other way to begin. Most of the papers were engineering blueprints and pages of equations and incomprehensible to them both. There were tax forms, of which John took up eagerly, hoping for information about Fredbear's family diner, but he gave up with a sigh after 15 minutes, flinging the papers down. Charlie, I can't figure this out. Let's check through the rest, but I don't think puzzling is going to turn us into mathematics or accountants. Stubbornly, Charlie kept picking through the papers, hoping for something she would understand. But you again! Get out of here! Okay, so... She picked up a sheaf of paper, trying to straighten the next stack, and a photograph fell out of the pile. John snatched it up. Charlie, look, he said, suddenly excited. She took it from his hand. It was her father in his workshop, wearing the yellow Freddy Fazbear costume. His head was tucked under his arms, staring slightlessly into the camera. But Charlie's father was smiling, his face pink and sweaty as if he had been in the costume for a long time. Beside him was a yellow Bonnie. The yellow rabbit, Charlie said. Jason said there was a yellow rabbit. But your father is in the bear costume. The rabbit must be a robot, Charlie said. Look at the eyes. They're red. She peered closer. The eyes were glinting red, but they weren't glowing. And in a moment she saw why. It's not red eyes. It's red eye. There's a person in there. So who was in the suit? Charlie finished the question for him. We have to go to the library, John said, jumping to his feet. Charlie stayed where she was, still staring down at the picture. Charlie? Yeah, she said. He held out a hand to pull her up. As they descended to the staircase, John hung back briefly, but Charlie did not turn around. She knew what he was imagining, but she was picturing it too, the stain on the floor slowly spreading. Okay, let me see. How many pages left in this chapter? I guess they're getting closer to solving this mystery. Charlie drove fast to the library, a grim urgency hanging over her. The promised storm was in the air, the smell of it rising like a warning. In a strange way, the worsening weather satisfied something in Charlie. Storms inside, storms outside. I've never been this eager to get to the library, John joked, and she smiled tightly without humor. The main library in Hurricane was next to the elementary school where they had gone before the memorial ceremony, and as they got out of the car, Charlie glanced at the playground, envisioning children screaming and laughing as they ran circles immersed in their games. We were so young. They hurried up the few steps to the library together, a square modern brick building that had looked as if it had come paired with the books beside it. She only remembered the library vaguely from her childhood. They had gone infrequently, and Charlie had spent all her time there sitting on the floor in the children's sections. Being able to see over the information desk was slightly disconcerting. The librarian was young, Charlie thought, an athletic-seeming woman in slacks and a purple sweater. She smiled brightly. What can I do for you? She said. Charlie said, hesitated. Charlie hesitated. The woman was maybe in her late 20s. Charlie realized that ever since she returned to Hurricane, she had been paying attention to age, scrutinizing each face and calculating how old they had been when it happened. This woman would have been a teenager. It doesn't matter, she thought. You still have to ask. She opened her mouth to ask for information about Fred bears, but what came out instead was, "Are you from Hurricane?" The librarian shook her head. "No, I'm from Indiana." Charlie felt her body relax. She wasn't here. "Do you have any information on a place called Fredbear's Family Diner?" Charlie asked, and the woman frowned. "Do you mean Freddy Fazbear's? They used to have one of those here, I think," she said vaguely. "No, that's not the one," Charlie said, ready to be endlessly patient with the library, who was, thankfully, probably the only person in town who was somehow unaware of her history. For town records, things like incorporation and licensing, you would have to go to City Hall. But she checked her watch. "It's after 5, so not today anyway. I have newspapers all the way back to the 1880s if you want to look at microfilm," she said eagerly. "Yeah, okay," Charlie said. "I'm Harriet," the woman said, as she led them to the door at the back of the building. She recited their names dutifully, and she chattered on like a child about to display her favorite toy. So you know what microfilm is, right? It's because we can't keep stacks and stacks of paper here. There's no room, and eventually they would rot. So it's a way to preserve them. They take pictures and save the film. It's almost like a movie reel, you know? Very small, so you need a machine to see it. "We know what it is," John cut in when she paused. "We just don't know how to use it." "Well, that's what I'm here for," Harriet declared, and threw the door open. Inside was a table with a computer monitor. The monitor sat on top of a little box with a small wheel on each side. Two handles stuck out in front. Charlie and John looked at it bemusedly, and Harriet grinned. You want the local papers, right? What years? Charlie counted backwards. 1979 to 1982, she hazarded. Harriet beamed and left the door open. John bent forward to peer at the machine, rattling the handles a little. Careful, Charlie warned jokingly. I think she might be lost without that thing. John raised his hand to his shoulder and stepped back. Harriet reappeared with what looked like 4 small movie reels and held them up. What year do you want to start with? She said. 1979. I guess, Charlie said. 1979? I guess, Charlie said, and Harriet nodded. And she went to the machine and threaded the film through expertly. She flipped the switch and the screen came to life. A newspaper appeared. January 1st, 1979, John announced, leaning forward to read the headlines. Politics, somebody won a sports game, and there was some weather. Also, there was a bakery giving away free cookies to celebrate the new year. Sounds like now, except no cookies. You use these to see more, Harriet said, manipulating the controls. Let me know if you need help switching the reels. Have fun, you two. She winked conspiratorially and closed the door behind her as she left. Charlie positioned herself in front of the machine, and John stood behind her, his hand on her chair. It felt good to have him close, like he would stop anything that tried to sneak up on her. This is pretty cool, he remarked, and she nodded, scanning the paper for answers. Okay, let's narrow it down, she said grimly. What's the thing most likely to make the papers? I was looking for an opening announcement, Charlie said. Yeah, but what's going to make the papers? Sorry, he added. I didn't want to say it, but we have to. Sammy, Charlie said. We should have started with Sammy. We moved to the new house when I was 3, and it's gotta be 1982. Carefully, they switched the reel. Charlie eyed the door as they did, as if nervous that Harriet might catch them making a mistake. When's your birthday? John said, sitting to take her place. Don't you know? She teased. He screwed up his face in an exaggerated mime of thinking. May 13th, she said at last. She laughed, startled. How did you know? He grinned up to her. Because I know things, she said. Well, why does it matter? You remember being 3 when you moved, but you didn't turn 3 until May, so we knock out 5 months. Do you remember anything about the restaurant the night Sammy disappeared? Charlie felt herself flinch with an almost physical pain. Sorry, she said. Her face felt too hot. Sorry you startled me. Let me think. She closed her eyes. The restaurant, the closet hung full with costumes, and she and Sammy were there safe in the dark until the door opened and the rabbit appeared, leaning over them with its awful face and its human eyes. Charlie's heart was racing. She slowed her breathing and held out a hand. John took hold of it. She held on tight as if he could anchor her. The rabbit leaning over them, the yellow teeth beneath the mask and beneath the rabbit, what was behind the rabbit? The restaurant was open. She could hear voices, people. There were more people in costumes. Other performers? Robots? No. She almost had it. Scarcely breathing, Charlie tried to coax out the thought, scared to frighten it away. Move slowly, speak softly. She had it snatched from the depths of her mind and held it wriggling in her fingers. Her eyes snapped open. John, I know when it was, she said. Earlier that night, they were still wide awake. The closet opened and her mother looked in. She was haloed by the light from behind her, smiling down at her twins. Radiant in her long, elegant dress, her flowing hair, her gleaming tiara. Mommy's a princess, Charlie murmured sleepily, and her mother bent down and kissed her cheek. Just for tonight, she whispered, and then she left them in the dark to sleep. She was a princess, she said exactly. What? Who? My mother, Charlie said. She was dressed up as a princess. It was a Halloween party. John, go to November 1st. John struggled briefly with the controls, and then it was there. The headline was small, but it was on the front page of the paper. On Monday, November 1st, toddler snatched. Charlie turned away. John began to read aloud, and Charlie cut in, stopping him. Don't, she said. Just tell me if it has anything useful. He was quiet. She stared anxiously at the door, tracing the knots in false wood with her eyes. There's a picture, he said mildly. You need to look. She leaned over her shoulder. The story had continued over an entire page inside with pictures of the restaurant, of the family all together. And of her, and of Sammy, though neither of the twins were named in the article. In the bottom left corner, there was a picture of her father and another man. Their arms were slung around each other's shoulders, and they were grinning happily. John, Charlie said, it says there were joint owners, John said quietly. No, Charlie said, unable to take her eyes off the picture from the face they both knew. Suddenly, the door behind them erupted in pounding from outside, and they both jumped. Charlie, John, are you in there? Marla, they said as one. And Charlie rushed to the door and threw it open. Marla, what is it? She was red-faced and breathless, and Harriet was anxiously hovering behind her. Marla's hair was wet, water dripped down her face, but she did not wipe it away or even seem to notice. I guess the rain started. Charlie thought the mundane reflection drifting unbidden into her head despite her alarm. He's gone! Jason's gone! Marla cried. What? Johnny said. He's gone back to Freddy's. I know. He's gone. Jason's gone, Marla cried. What? John said. He's gone back to Freddy's. I know he has, she said. He kept saying we should go back, that we shouldn't just be hanging around all day. I thought he was in another room, but I looked everywhere. I know that's where he is, she said. It's all in one breath, and ended gasping, a faint whining hun resonating under her breathing, and needing sound she seemed unable to stop making. Oh no, Charlie said. Come on, Marla pressed. She was jittering, vibrating. John put a hand on her shoulder as if to confront her, and she shook her head. Don't try to calm me down. Just come with me. She insisted, but there was no anger, only desperation. She turned and almost ran out the door, and John and Charlie followed with an apologetic look for the bemused librarian they had left behind them. Well, that's 3 people gone. Alright. Alright. 8 down, 5 more to go. Just one more chapter and then we'll end the stream. How many pages is this chapter? Why am I not surprised? Over 30 pages. Why am I not surprised? Chapter 9. Carlton opened his eyes, disoriented, his head stuffed tight with a massive pulsing ache. He was half sitting stiffly, propped against a wall, and he found he could not move his arms. His body was covered in little random places of sharp pain and tingling numbness. Oh, Carlton! We're in Carlton's point of view now. Nice! He tried to shift away from the discomfort, but he was restrained somehow, and the little moves he couldn't make just made new places hurt. He looked around the room, trying to get his bearings. It looked like a storage room. There were boxes along the walls, and discarded cans of paint and other cleaning supplies littered the floor, but there was more. There were piles of furry fabric everywhere. Carlton peered at them sleepily. He felt muzzy, but if he closed his eyes, he could just fall back asleep so easily. No, he shook his head hard, trying to clear it, and yelped, "Oh no," he groaned, as the throbbing in his head demanded attention and his stomach flipped. He clenched his jaw and closed his eyes, waiting for the pounding and nausea to recede. Eventually they did. Fading back to something almost manageable, he opened his eyes, starting over. This time his mind had cleared a little, and he looked down at his body to see his restraints. Oh no. He was wedged inside the heavy barrel-shaped torso of a Uh-oh. She was wedged inside the heavy barrel-shaped torso of a mascot costume, the headless top half of some kind of animal. His arms were trapped inside the torso section. He pinned to his sides in an unnatural position of some sort of framework. The arms of the costume hung limp and empty from the sides. His legs stuck out incongruously from the bottom, looking small and thin in contrast. He could feel other things inside the mascot's torso. Pieces of metal that pressed against his back and poked into him. He could feel raw patches of his skin. He could feel raw patches on his skin, and he could not tell if the thing he felt trickling down his back was sweat or blood. Nothing was pressing into the sides of his neck. When he turned his head, whether it was dug into his skin. The costume's fur was dirty and matted, a faded color that might once have been a bright blue, but was now only a bluish approximation of beige. He could see a head of the same color a few feet away sitting on a cardboard box, and with a flicker of curiosity he looked at it. He could not tell what it was supposed to be. It looked as if someone had been told, make an animal, and had done just that, careful not to make it look like any specific type of animal. He looked around the room, comprehension dawning. He knew where he was. The piles of fabric had faces. They were empty costume mascots from the restaurant, deflated, collapsed, and staring empty-eyed at him, like they wanted something. He looked around, trying to assess calmly. Through his heart was fluttering alarmingly in his chest. The room was small, a single bulb overhead, lighting it dimly and flickering ever so slightly and giving the place a disquieting impression of movement. A small metal desk fan, brown with rust, gently oscillated in the corner, but the air it blew was heavy with the stale sweat of costumes, left unwashed for a decade. Carlton was too hot, the air felt too thick. He tried to stand, but without his arms he could not brace himself, and as he moved he felt another violent wave of nausea and a sudden angry surge of pain in his head. "I wouldn't do that," a raspy voice muttered. Carlton looked around, seeing no one, then the door opened. It moved slowly, and somewhere beneath his terror, Carlton felt a twinge of impatience. "Who is it? Let me out of this," he said in a panicked desperation. The door squealed like an injured animal as it glided open, almost of its own accord, the frame empty. After a moment's pause, a yellow rabbit poked out of its head around the corner, its ears tilting at a jaunty angle, and it was still for a moment, almost posing. Then it came in with a bouncing walk, graceful, with none of the stiff, mechanistic movements of the animatronic animal. It did a small dance and spun and took a deep bow. Then it reached up and took off its own head, revealing the man inside the costume. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised," Carlton said, his nerves triggering an unatomic wisecrack. "Never trust a rabbit, I say." It didn't make sense. It wasn't funny, but the words were coming out of his mouth without any input from his brain. He felt sick and his head still ached, but he had a sudden visceral clarity. This is what happened to Michael. You are what happened to Michael. "Don't speak," Dave said. "Don't speak," Dave said. Carlton opened his mouth to answer back, but the smart remark died on his tongue when he saw the guard's face. When he had seemed somehow faded when they met, depleted and ineffectual, but now, as he stood over Carlton in his absurd-looking rabbit costume, he looked different. His face was the same, technically, his gaunt features and sunken eyes, his skin that had seemed to have worn thin, ready to snap from strain. But now there was a mean, undeniable strength in him, a rodentine vitality that Carlton recognized. It had occurred to Carlton years before there were two types of nasty people. There were the obvious ones, like his 6th grade English teacher who yelled and threw erasers, or the kid in 5th grade who picked fights with smaller children after school. That type was easy. Their offenses, public, brutal, and undeniable. But then there was the other kind of petty tyrant. Those who grew spiteful with their small scraps of power, feeling more and more abused by the year, by family who did not appreciate them, by neighbors who slighted them in imperceptible ways, by a world that left them somehow lacking something essential. Before him stood someone who had spent some of his life fighting like a cornered rat that he had taken on the mantle of bitter sadism as an integral part of himself. He would strike out against others and revel in their pain, feeling righteously and that the world owed him his cruel pleasures. The guard's face, with its malevolent delight in Carlton's pain and fear, was one of the most terrifying things he had ever seen. He opened and closed his mouth, then valiantly found his voice. What kind of a name for a serial killer is Dave? He said. It came out as a trembling croak, lacking even the echo of bravado. Dave did not seem to hear him. I told you not to move, Carlton, he said calmly. He set the rabbit's head down on a plastic crate and began fiddling with the fastenings at the back of his neck. It's not an order, it's a friendly warning. Do you know what I've put you in? Your girlfriend? Carlton said, and Dave made a thin curve of a smile. You're amusing, he said with distaste. But no, you're not wearing a costume. You're not wearing a costume, Carlton. Not precisely. You see, these suits were designed for two purposes. To be worn by men like me. He gestured fluently towards himself with something that might have been of pride. And to be used as working animatronics like the ones you see on stage. Do you understand? Carlton nodded, or began to, but Dave's raised eyebrow stopped him. I said don't move. He said. The neck of his costume came open, and he began to undo a second fastening at the back as he talked. You see, all the animatronic parts in that suit are still in it. They are simply held back by spring locks like this. Dave went to the pile of fuzzy costumes and selected one, bringing the fuzzy green torso headless over to Carlton. He held out the costume, waggling two twisted pleats of metal that were attached to its sides of the neck. These are spring locks, he said, bringing the piece of metal so close to Carlton's face, he almost could not focus his eyes on it. Watch. He did something, touched some piece of the lock so imperceptibly that Carlton could not see what he had done, and it snapped shut with a sound like a backfiring car. Carlton stiffened, suddenly taking the order not to move deathly seriously. That's a very old costume. One of the first ones Henry made. You can trip these spring locks very, very easily if you don't know what you're doing, Dave went on. It takes almost no movement at all. Henry? Carlton said, trying to focus on what he was being told. He could still hear the snap, as if he had lodged it in his head like a song that kept repeating. I'm going to die, he thought for the first time since waking. This man will kill me. I will die, and then what? Will anyone even know? He set his jaw and met Dave's eyes. Who's Henry? Henry, Dave repeated. Your friend Charlie's father. He looked surprised. Do you not know that he made this place? Oh, right, well, Carlton said confusedly. I just always thought of him as Charlie's dad. Of course, Dave said. The kind of polite murmur people made when they didn't care. Well, that's one of his first suits, he said, gesturing at Carlton. And if you trigger those spring locks, two things will happen. First, all the locks will snap right into you, making deep cuts all over your body. And a split second later, all the animatronic parts that have been holding back, all that sharp steel and hard plastic, will instantly be driven into your body. You will die, but it will be slow. You'll feel your organs punctured, the suit will grow wet in your blood, and you will know you're dying for long, long minutes. You'll try to scream, but you will be unable to. Your vocal cords will be severed, and your lungs will fill with your own blood until you drown in it. There was a faraway look in his eyes, and Carlton knew what chilling certainty that Dave wasn't predicting. He was reminiscing. How? Carlton's voice broke, and he tried again. How do you know that? He said, managing a raspy whisper. Dave met his eyes and smiled widely. How do you think? He set down the costume he was holding and reached up to undo the final piece of his own. It took time. Carlton watched for several minutes as Dave romanced whatever mechanism lay under the collar. He took the costume torso off with a flourish, and Carlton made an involuntary sound, a helpless, frightened mule. Dave had been shirtless under the costume, and now his bare chest was clearly visible. Even in the dim, flickering light, his skin was horribly scarred, with raised white lines that scored his flesh with a symmetrical pattern, each side of his side body mirroring the other. Dave saw him looking and laughed a sudden happy sound. Carlton shivered at it. Dave raised his arms out from his body and turned over in a circle, giving Carlton ample time to see that the scars were everywhere, covering his back like a faint lace shirt stretching to his waist of the rabbit pants as if they contained all the way down. On the back of his neck, there was the largest and most visible. Two scars like parallel lines were etched from the nape of his neck all the way to his scalp, disappearing into his hair. Carlton tried to swallow. His mouth was so dry he could not have spoken, even if there had been anything this day. Dave smiled unpleasantly. "Don't move," he said again. "He's here. He has to be here," Marla cried, staring despairingly at the door to Freddy's. She was clasping and unclasping her hands, the knuckles going white. Charlie watched her helplessly. There was nothing to say. The door was no longer covered in chains. Instead, it was simply no longer a door. It must have welled over. The metal was melted seamlessly into the frame, and the hinges were gone, covered in crude, patchy solder. They all stared, not fully able to comprehend what they were looking at. Charlie shifted her feet. She had stepped in a puddle as they hurried from the car, and now her shoes and socks were soaked and freezing, and seemed unforgivable to be focused on her own discomfort in such a moment. But she could not stop her attention from drifting to it. "This is insane," Marla said, her mouth agape. "Who does this?" She threw up her hands in frustration. "Who does something like that?" She was almost shouting. "Someone did that. Someone wielded this shut. What if Jason is still in there?" "Someone wielded this shut. What if Jason is in there?" Marla put her hands all over her face. Jessica and Lamar stepped forward to comfort her, but she waved them away. "I'm fine," she said tightly, but she did not move. Still staring at the place in the wall that had once been a door, she looked smaller, lesser, and panicked energy that had been driving her was gone, leaving her empty and without purpose. She looked at Charlie, ignoring the others, and Charlie met her eyes uncomfortably. "What do we do now?" Marla asked. Charlie shook her head, and "I don't know, Marla," she said uselessly. "If he's still in there, we have to get him out. There has to be a way." There has to be some other way. There has to be another way in," John agreed. Though he sounded sure Then Charlie felt. Freddy's had windows, a service door, right? There must have been fire exits. There has to be something. Stop, Marla cried. They all froze in place. She was pointing at the floor. What is it? What is it? What is it? Charlie asked, coming up next to her. It's Jason's footprint, Marla said. Look, you can see the imprint. It's those silly shoes he spent a year's allowance on. Charlie looked. Marla was right. There was a muddy footprint about Jason's size, still fresh. Marla's face was alive, and again fiery and determined. He must have just been here, Marla said. Look, you can see the tracks turn and leave again. The door must have been already welded when he got there. He's probably still here somewhere. Come on. Jason's tracks were heading rather farther down the alley into the darkness, and the group crouched low to the ground. Following his trail, Charlie hung back, not really helping, but keeping an eye on the bobbing flashlight ahead. There was something she was forgetting, something she should know. Something about Freddy. She noticed that she was apart. John let the others move ahead. You okay? He asked in a low voice, and Charlie shook her head. I'm fine, he said. Go ahead. He waited for her to say more, but she was starting ahead into the dark. Another way in. Found it, Jessica's voice peered in the dark, and Charlie came back to herself and jogged to catch up to the others. Lamar had the flashlight again. He was aiming it at an air vent close to the ground. The vent was old and rusty, and its covering lay flat on the ground amid scattered footsteps and clumps of mud. Jason, what are you doing? Marla gasped and knelt beside the vent. What are you thinking? There was an edge to her voice, something teetering between panic and relief. We have to go after him, she said. Charlie watched dubious, but said nothing. It was John who spoke up. It's too small, he said. I don't think any of us will fit. Marla looked at herself, then the others one by one, calculating. Jessica, she said decisively. Come on. What? Jessica looked to the side as if there might be another of her. I don't think I'll fit, Marla. You're the skinniest, Marla said shortly. Just try, okay? Jessica nodded and went to the vent, kneeling in the muddy concrete that was the alley's floor. She studied the hole in the wall and for a moment tried to squeeze in, but her shoulders barely cleared the space, and after a moment she pulled back out of breath. Marla, I can't fit. I'm sorry, she said. You can fit, Marla said. Please, Jessica. Jessica looked back, and when Charlie saw her face, it was almost white, harshly motionless. She's claustrophobic, Charlie thought. But before she could speak, Jessica was back in the air vent, twisting herself, trying to fit. Please, Marla said again, and Jessica shot back out like something had bitten her. I can't, Marla, she said, her breathing shallow and fast, and if she must have been running full out. I don't fit. There has to be another way in, Charlie stepped in, reaching her arm beneath Marla and Jessica as though breaking up a fight. Charlie closed her eyes, trying again to remember. She pictured the restaurant, trying to see it, not as she had been the last few days, but it had been years before. The lights were bright. It was full of people. It used to get hot, stuffy, she said. In the summer, it smelled like pizza and old French fry grease and sweaty kids. And my dad would say, that's it. That's it. He would say, whose brilliant idea was it to put a skylight in the closet? She finished triumphantly, relieved. She could picture the little supply room with the open roof. She and Sammy would sneak away and sit in there for a few minutes, enjoying the small stream of fresh air that filtered down from outside. So that's it. Let's get to the roof, John said, breaking Charlie's drift into memory. What roof? Marla said, starting the top of the closed hall. She was no longer in a full-blown panic, reassured by evidence that Jason was still alive, but her anxiety was still palpable. Her glance darted constantly around the little group as if her little brother might suddenly appear from those shadows. It's been covered over, like everything else, Lamar chimed in. Maybe not, Charlie said. The roof of the mall is pretty high. I bet there's a crawl space at least. A crawl space? John said excitedly. You mean a crawl space between the roof of Freddy's and the roof of the mall? Up there? She started up into the darkness for a moment. A crawl space? He repeated, his voice a little meeker. Charlie was busy studying the ceiling of the corridor, reassuring it in her head against what they had seen of the outside of the building. It was different. She was sure of it. This isn't the roof of the mall. It's not high enough, she said, feeling a spark of encouragement. She set off briskly down the hall, not waiting for the others. They followed, trailing behind her, and the space above her suddenly became illuminated as Lamar caught up and cast the beam on the flashlight upward. Charlie was going back and forth, looking from wall to ceiling and back again while trying to picture the space outside. And the ceiling of this hall is probably level with the roof of the Freddy's. Jessica's voice came from behind. Charlie, who startled briefly, had been so intent on pursuit she had lost track of her friends. We have to get up there, Charlie said, turning back to the group expectantly. They looked blankly at her for a second, then Lamar's arms moved reflexively. She was about to raise his hand. He caught himself and cleared his throat instead. I hate to point out the obvious, but Lamar said, gesturing. About 10 feet ahead of them, a maintenance ladder rested against the old brick. Charlie grinned and hurried to the ladder, waving for John to follow. They grabbed it together. It was heavy metal and covered with spatters of paint. It was manageable to carry. When Charlie had a firm grasp on one side of the ladder, she turned her face back to the ceiling, searching. There is probably a hole or hatch or something, she said. A hole or hatch or something? John echoed with a half smile, and he lifted the other end of the ladder. Do you have a better idea? Now come on, she jerked the ladder forward so hard John stumbled and almost fell. They moved slowly. With one flashlight, they could not see where they were going and examined the walls at the same time. So every few yards, they stopped for Lamar to run the light back and forth across the place where the brick wall met the dripping ceiling of the makeshift hallway. Though it slowed them down, Charlie was grateful for the brakes. The ladder industrial metal was heavy. She could have asked the others to switch off, but it felt essential somehow that she be part of the physical process. She wanted to help. Marla's agitation was growing as they went, and after a few rounds of move and scan, she started calling Jason's name softly. Jason, can you hear me? He's inside. He's inside, John said shortly. He can't hear you. His voice was strained with the weight of the ladder. He had the wider end, and he sounded almost snappish. Marla glared at him. You don't know that. Marla, stop it, Jessica said. We're doing everything we can. Marla didn't answer. A few minutes later, they came to the end of the hallway. So now what? John said. I don't know, Charlie said, puzzled. I was positive we would find something. Is that the way life usually works for you? John teased, raising an eyebrow at her. From down the hall, Lamar let out a triumphant cry. Found it! Marla took off toward him and a run, and Jessica followed a little more cautiously behind, wary of obstacles in the dark. Charlie gave John a wink and picked up the ladder again. He hurried to lift his side, and then they lunged it back the way they came. When Charlie and John caught up to the rest of the group, all three were looking up at the ceiling. Charlie mimicked their posture. Sure enough, there was a square trapdoor big enough for an adult to pass through, its edges barely visible in the darkness. Without speaking, they set up the ladder. It was perhaps 10 feet high and rose close enough to the ceiling to access the door easily. Marla climbed up first as Lamar steadied the ladder on one side, Jessica on the other. John and Charlie watched as Marla ascended. So the trapdoor there, John pointed up at it. The trapdoor of this hallway is right next to Freddy's. That will get us onto the roof of Freddy's, which is under the roof of the mall. in a crawl space, and on Freddy's roof there is a skylight we will find visible while crawling through this crawl space. He drew an invisible diagram in the air with his fingers as he spoke, and his tone with edged with skepticism. Charlie did not respond. Marla's footsteps on the ladder sounded through the hall, tiny, heavy, tinny thuds that echoed unsteadily around them. Once we find the skylight in the crawl space, John went on, not certain if Charlie was even listening, we are going to drop down through the skylight and into Freddy's, possibly with no way of getting back out. At the top of the ladder, Marla fiddled with something on the ceiling as the others could not see, making little mutters of frustration. Is it locked? Charlie called up. Okay, sure, John said, aware by now that he was talking only to himself. That makes sense. The bolt is just stuck, Marla said. I need... Ha! A dull snapping sound rang out. Got it. She cried out. She raised her hands over her head and pressed upwards, and the door slowly opened above her until it tipped over and fell with a thud. So much for sneaking in, John said drily. It doesn't matter, Charlie said. We still have to go. Besides, do you really think whoever's in there doesn't know we're coming? Above them, Marla was navigating her way up through the door. She braced her arms on either side of the space and pushed up off the ladder. It swayed dangerously, and Lamar and Jessica clutched it, trying to stabilize it. But it was not necessary. Marla was already up and through on the roof. They waited for her to say something. Marla? She called finally. Yeah, I'm fine, Marla said. What do you see? Charlie called. Throw me the light, Marla said, emerged from the trapdoor, flapping impatiently. Lamar got a bit closer and carefully lobbed the flashlight up. Marla snatched it out of the air, and immediately the beam vanished. The light had gone out. In the crawl space, Marla sat in the dark trying to fix the flashlight. She shook it, rattling the batteries, and flipped the switch on and off uselessly. And as she unscrewed the top of the light and blew it into the battery crotch, she felt a rising panic. Since realizing Jason had gone, Marla's entire being had been focused on him. It was only now, alone in the darkness, that she began to think about the danger she herself might be in. She screwed the top back of the flashlight, and it came on instantly. The light flashed in her eyes, briefly clouding her vision. She pointed away, then carefully swept it in a circle around her, revealing a sprawling void in all directions. It was the roof of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. What do you see? Charlie called again. You are right. There's space, but not much. It's so dark, and it smells awful up here. Her voice sounded shaky even to her own ears, and suddenly she was desperate not to be alone in this place. Hurry, don't leave me up here by myself. We're coming, Jessica called up to her. Me next, Charlie said, stepping forward. The ladder was rusty, and it made squeaking complaints as she climbed, protesting her weight as she moved from step to step. But it felt sturdy, and quickly she reached the trapdoor and did as Marla had done. She stood on the top step, so she was head and shoulders through the roof, and braced her arms on either side and pushed off the ladder, almost jumping, to land on Freddy's roof. There was not room to stand, scarcely room to sit. The space between the restaurant and the mall's roof above it, it was less than a yard. Something was rattling above them, as if stones were falling overhead, and it took Charlie a moment to realize that it was the rain thundering on the uninsulated tin. Water dripped in on her head, and when she looked up, she saw a place where the metal seams had not been jointed. Two corrugated sheets of simply lined up next to each other, allied by circumstances. She wiped her palms on her jeans. The shingles of the roof were wet, and her hands were covered in grit, dust, and something slick and more unpleasant. She looked toward Marla, who was a few feet away. Here, come on, get out of their way, Marla said, motioning her over, and Charlie hurried on her hands and knees. Jessica's head appeared in a trapdoor, and carefully she made her way up into the crawl space, safely on the roof. Jessica looked around as if gouging something. Concerned, Charlie remembered her fear in the air vent, but Jessica took a long, deep breath. I can handle this, she thought, though she did not sound as if she believed her own words. A moment later, Lamar was next to him. She quickly reclaimed the flashlight and aimed it back toward the trapdoor. After a moment, John scrambled up into the crawl space and something banged loudly beneath them, the sound repeating, but John startled at the sound. Sorry, she said. It was the ladder. Charlie, which way? Marla asked. Oh, Charlie closed her eyes again, retracing her steps as she had while they'd searched for a way in. Straight across, I think, she said. As long as we get to the far side, we'll find it. Without waiting for responses, she started crawling in the direction she thought was right. A second later, light appeared ahead of her. Thanks, she called back softly to Lamar, who was steadying the flashlight, trying to anticipate where Charlie would go. I don't have anything else to do, he whispered. The crawl space was wide. It should have felt spacious, but there was support beams and pipes strewn at random, intersecting the space or running across the roof below them. So it was a little like navigating a very cramped forest, ducking vines and climbing over fallen trees. The roof of Freddy's had a shallow upward slope. They would have to go down again once they reached the middle. The shingles beneath their hands and feet were soggy in a deep swollen way that suggested they had not been truly dry in years, and a moldy smell arose from them. Every once in a while, Charlie wiped her hands on her pants. Knowing they would only be clean for a moment from time to time, she thought she heard something skitter by. It sounds like a little too far away to be coming from their group, but she ignored them. They have more right to be here than we do, she thought, though she was not certain what species they might be. The roof of them followed a bizarre pattern, sloping up and down without regard to the floor beneath, so that at one point it opened. Sorry, I was thinking of something else. At one point, it opened 4 feet above their heads, then at another, plunged downward so close that it grazed their backs, forcing them to duck their heads and wriggle awkwardly through. Jessica was right behind Charlie, and from time to time she could hear her friend make soft, frightened noises, but every time she looked back, Jessica just nodded stone-faced. They continued until they reached the wall that marked the edge of the roof. Okay, Charlie called, half turning behind her. It should be here. Let's spread out and look. No, wait, what's that? Marla said, pointing. Charlie could not see what Marla had spotted, but she followed the direction until she came to it. The skylight was a flat glass plane in the roof, framed like a small window, a single panel with no visible handles, hinges, or latches. They leaned over it, trying to see into the room below, but the glass was too covered in grime for anything to show through. Jason reached forward to try to clean it with a sleeve. He came away with the arm of his shirt black, but it had done no good. At least half the dirt was on the other side. and the skylight was still opaque with filth. It's just a closet, okay? Charlie said. But is anyone in the closet? Lamar said. It doesn't matter, Marla said. We don't have a choice. Everyone looked at Charlie, who thoughtfully studied the skylight. It swings in, she said. You pull down on this side, she pointed, and it swings. There's a latch on the inside right there. She touched the side of the skylight, thinking, maybe if she pushed on it, and it gave away almost instantly, jolting her with a sudden panicked sense of falling, even though her weight was solidly on the roof. That's kind of narrow, John said. The skylight did not open all the way. The glass was just tilted inward a little, barely enough for a person to slip through. I didn't build it, Charlie said, slightly irritated. This is it. So if you're going, go. Without waiting for a response, she swung her legs over the sill and lowered herself down, dangling for a moment in the dark. Closing her eyes and hoping the floor was not as far away as she remembered, she let go and fell. She landed. The shock of impact ran through her legs, but it passed quickly. Bend your knees when you land, she called up, and she... Bend your knees when you land, she called up as she got out of the way. Marla dropped through, and Charlie went to the door, trying to find a light switch. Her fingers stumbled across the switch, and she flipped it up. The old fluorescent lights clicked and buzzed, and then slowly a dim, unreliable glow filled the space. "All right," she whispered with a thrill of excitement. She turned around as something brushed her face. She had a fleeting impression of big plastic and broken yellow teeth. She screamed and leapt back, clutching for balance at shelves that swayed as she grabbed them. The head she had touched, an uncovered wire frame for a costume with nothing but eyes and teeth to decorate it, wobbled precariously on the shelf beside Charlie. And then it fell to the ground, her heart still pounding. Charlie brushed it at herself roughly as if she were covered in spiderwebs. Her legs unsteady as she moved back and forth with agitation. The head rolled across the floor and then came to rest at her feet, looking up at her with its cheerful, sinister smile. Charlie jerked back from the ghastly grin and something grabbed her from behind. She tried to yank free, but she was stuck. A pair of metal arms wrapped around her. The bodiless limbs clung to her shirt, then their hinges biting into the cloth, and as she tried to wrest herself away, her hair was caught, too, tangling her deeper into the wire until she felt like she would be consumed. Charlie screamed again, and the arms reached out further, seeming to grow as she struggled against them. She fought back with all her strength, fueled by terror and a base, frantic fury that this thing would hurt her. "Charlie, stop!" Marla cried. "Charlie!" Marla grabbed her arm, trying to stop her frantic movement, using one hand to disengage Charlie's hair from the metal frame. "Charlie, it's not real, it's just robot parts," she said. But Charlie pulled away from Marla, still in panic, and smacked her head into a cardboard box. She cried out, startled as the box overturned. Eyes the size of fists fell out of the ground like rain, showering down with clatter and rolling everywhere, covering the floor. Charlie stumbled and stepped on one of the hard plastic orbs, sending her feet out from under her. She grabbed at the shelf, missed, and fell on her back, landing with a thud that took the wind out of her. Stunned and gasping, she looked up. There were eyes everywhere, not just on the floor, but in the walls. They looked out at her from the dark, deep-socket, shadowed eyes, peering down from the shelves all around her. She was stared, unable to look away. Charlie, come on!" Marla was there, kneeling anxiously over her. She grabbed Charlie's arm again and pulled until Charlie came upright. Charlie still did not have her breath back, and as she inhaled thinly, she began to cry. Marla hugged her tightly, and Charlie let her. It's okay, Marla whispered, as Charlie tried to calm herself, looking around the storeroom for distraction. "It's not real," she told herself. They were in a storeroom, just a closet, and these were all spare parts. The air was thick with dust, and it trickled at her nose and throat as it poured off the shelves restlessly. The rest of the group dropped through the skylight one by one. John came last, landing in the middle of the room with a thud. Jessica sneezed. "You okay?" John said as soon as he saw Charlie. "Yeah, I'm fine." Charlie disentangled himself from Marla's and crossed her arms, still collecting herself. We can't get back up through here," John said, looking up at the skylight. "We just need something to stand on," Charlie said, or we can climb a shelf. Jessica shook her head. No, look at the way it's opened. Charlie looked. The skylight opened downward, so the pane glass had sloped in at a gentle angle. It's just enough to have let them through. To get out, they would have to... Oh, she said. There would be no getting out. However close they got to the skylight, the pane of glass would always be in the way, sticking out in the precise space they needed to pass through. If anyone tried to get a grip on the roof, they would have leaned so far over the glass that they would have fall off the ladder. We might be able to break the glass, John started, but the metal frame is going to be dangerous to climb over, even more dangerous with shards of broken glass. He fell silent, and thought it through again, his face grim. It doesn't matter, Charlie said. We'll have to find another way out. Let's start looking. They peered cautiously onto the hallway. Lamar had turned off the flashlight, but it's easy enough to see their surroundings now with the light from the closet seeping into the hall. At least nothing's dripping from the ceiling, Charlie thought, wiping her hands on her pants again. The floor was black and white tile and glossy as if it had just been polished. There were children's drawings on the walls, rustling with the air from the open sky. Charlie remained motionless, more than aware of how much noise she had just made. Does it know we're here? She wondered, realizing she meant the building itself. It felt as if Freddy's was conscious of their presence, as if it reacted to them like a living, breathing thing. She reached out to brush her fingers against its wall, tracing lightly as if she were petting it. The plaster was still and cold, inanimate, and Charlie pulled her hand back. She wondered what Freddy's would do. They wound around one corner then another, and then stopped at the entrance to Pirate's Cove, hanging back from the doorway. Pirate's Cove. I have my bearings again. Charlie gazed at the little stage no longer lit, and the curtain that had hid its sole performer. A few small lights flickered on the sides of the stage then came on, illuminating the space with a pale gray glow. Charlie looked around and saw Lamar standing by the doorway with his hands on a switch. We don't have a choice, he said defensively, gesturing to his flashlight. Its light was failing. Charlie nodded resignedly, and Lamar switched off the dying flashlight. I want to take a look in this control room, Marla said, pointing to the small door nearby. Lamar, come with me. The rest of you try the other one. If we each take one set of cameras, we can see the whole restaurant. If Jason's in this place, we'll see him. I don't think we should split up, Charlie said. Wait, said Lamar. He passed John the dead light, freeing his hands from his pockets. He produced 2 walkie-talkies. They were large, black, boxy things. Charlie had only seen attached to police officers' belts. Where did you get those? She asked. Lamar smiled mysteriously. I'm afraid I can't tell you that, he said. He stole them from Carlton's house, Jessica stated, plainly taking one from his hand and examining it. No, they were in the garage. Mrs. Burke told me where to find them. They work. I tested. Mrs. Burke knew we would come here? Charlie thought. Marla just nodded. Maybe she had already known, or maybe nothing could surprise her anymore. Come on, Marla said, and walked between the tables in front of Pirate's Cove. Careful not to disturb anything, Lamar leaned over Jessica to show her how to use the walkie-talkie. It's this button, he said, indicating it, and then he took off after Marla. After a startled moment, the rest of them followed. Something clutched in Charlie's stomach. The reality that both Jason and Carlton might truly be in danger seizing her. It was not that she had forgotten, but while they were outside trying to solve the puzzles, it was possible to gain some distance from what was happening. She watched Marla stalking toward the control room with oblique authority. Marla crouched at the small door before turning to Charlie. "Go," she said, nodding toward the hall that led to the main dining area. They went, Charlie taking the lead as they crept down the hall, heading for the main stage. Marla looked at Lamar, who nodded. She grasped the doorknob, clenched her teeth, and forced the door open all in one motion. "Marla!" Marla jumped, barely suppressing a scream. Jason was huddled in the space between the monitors, his eyes wide and terrified, staring at the door like a frightened mouse. "Jason! Jason!" Marla crawled into the control room and swooped in. Marla crawled into the control room and swooped him into her arms. Jason hugged her back, for once grateful, even desperate for her intense affection. She held on tight, crushing him to her until he began to worry that he might in fact be crushed. From outside Marla's consuming embrace, Jason heard brief static. He looked over Marla's shoulder to see Lamar studying the walkie-talkie, preparing to speak into it. "Jessica, we found him. He's okay," he said. More static and words Jason did not quite catch came from the radio. The first wave of relief had worn off, and his ribs were starting to hurt. "Marla?" He tapped onto her shoulder, first gently, then harder. "Marla!" She let him go, but took hold of his shoulders for a moment, peering into his eyes as if to be sure it was really him, that he had not been somehow replaced or irrevocably damaged. "Marla, cool it," he said as casually as he could, managing to keep his voice from shaking. Marla let go of his shoulders, giving him a playful shove, and began to scold him as she pulled him the rest of the way out of the under the control panel. "Jason, how could you?" Marla was interrupted as Lamar descended the rest of the way into the small room. "Through the vent? Really?" Lamar laughed. "You could have been killed crawling through the air duct like that," Marla added, grasping his shoulders. Jason fought free, flailing his arms until she let him go. "Okay," he explained. Everybody missed me. Good. Glad to know I'm important." "You are important," Marla said fiercely, and Jason rolled his eyes theatrically. The little room lit up as Lamar flipped a switch, bringing the screens to life. Marla looked at Jason thoughtfully, then turned her attention to the security cameras. Let's see what we can here. Let's see what we can see. Sorry. Lamar looked from screen to screen. The top metal screen showed the main dining room and the stage, and as they watched, Charlie, Jessica, and John appeared, crossing the room in a V formation, Charlie at the front. "Look," Marla said, pointing to the screen at the lower right. "Look!" The night guard was there. Though they could not make out his face, his baggy uniform and sagging shoulders told them that it was the same man. He was in the hall near the restaurant's entrance, walking past the party rooms and the arcade with a slow, purposeful gait. Lamar warned them. Marla ordered urgently. Lamar spoke into the walkie-talkie. "Jessica, the guard is somewhere around here. Hide." There was no response from the radio, but on screen the group of three froze. Then as one made for the control room under the stage, squeezing in and closing themselves in just as the guard appeared in the doorway. Voices, people moving around. Carlton did not allow himself to sigh in relief. A rescue would do him any good as if he got his insides punctured by 100 tiny robot parts first. Instead, he continued with what he had been doing, across the floor and into the view of the security camera that perched near the ceiling just above the door. Each movement was so sacred, it felt like nothing, but he had he had been doing this for over an hour, and he was almost there. Huh? Oh, whoa, hold on. Let me see. No. There we are. There. Yeah. I can see myself. There. OBS disconnected for a bit. I guess I have to read that paragraph again. Although he was still afraid, still painfully aware of how easily he could trigger his own death, at some point the fear had dulled. Or perhaps he had just become accustomed to it. Panic could not last forever. Eventually, the adrenaline had run out. Now, at least, the need for slow, precise movements took precedence over everything else. It was all there was. Carlton made one final movement and stopped, closing his eyes for a moment. He had made it. Can't stop now. The others were here. It had to be them, and if they were looking for him, they would check the cameras. He stared up into the lens, willing himself to be seen. He could not wave or jump up and down. He tried rocking back and forth a little. But no matter how stiffly he held himself, he felt the press of spring locks ready to give. He bit his lip in frustration. "Just see me," he whispered to no one, but all at once he felt as if he had been heard. Felt the inexplicable sense of someone else's presence in the room. His heart began to race again. The adrenaline had given out, finding its second wind. Carefully, slowly, he looked around until something caught his eye. It was only one of the costumes slumped empty in the shadows, half hidden in the corner of the room. It was motionless, but its face was pointed directly at him, staring. As Carlton looked back, he realized that deep within the recesses of the costume's eye sockets were two tiny glints of light. He felt little muscles twitch and a restrained shudder running through his body. Not quite enough to get him killed, he did not look away. As Carlton held the creature's gaze, he felt himself begin to calm. His heart pounding eased, and his breath grew even. It was as though suddenly he was safe, though he knew the suit he was wearing would still only one flinch, one startled jump from killing him. Carlton kept looking at those two pinpoints of light, as he did, he heard a voice in a gasping instant. All the air was sucked from his lungs. As the voice spoke, that voice he would have known anywhere, that voice he would have given anything to hear again. Carlton began to weep, using all his will to keep his body from shaking. The eyes in the dark were intent on his face as the voice went on, speaking secrets to Carlton in the ringing silence, telling him things that he dreaded, things that someone had to hear. Alright then. We're on to the final 4 chapters, baby. And it looked... Okay, how long are these? Okay. Alright, the last 100 pages are... 400 pages... Alright. The last 100 pages are coming soon, ladies and gentlemen. Alright, we finished reading chapters 7 through 9, and if you want, I can read them to you tomorrow. So until then, that's all I gotta say, and I think it just got dark outside, but hey, I guess, yeah, it is dark outside. Still not getting used to daylight savings time, but oh well. Well, I'll be reading the final 4 chapters next time, so see you then!